So I'm Mark Weber of the Computer History Museum, and I am here on January 18th, 2023, with Doug Fairbairn, and we are interviewing Hector Ruiz, who is former CEO of AMD and major force in the semiconductor industry. So thank you so much for doing this.
Glad to do it.
So if we can just start with, what's your full name and when and where were you born?
That's going to take more than just 30 seconds. Because the name changed when I became a U.S. citizen a little bit. Not a lot used to, but I'll tell you why. My full name is Hector de Jesus Ruiz Cárdenas. Okay. Now you say, why is it that long? Well, kind of complicated. I was born on Christmas Day. I was born at home. My father couldn't find a doctor. He finally found a doctor that was willing to come to the house, and his name was Hector. So there's that piece. And being Hector, being a pagan name in a very Catholic family, that was frowned upon. You have to have a Christian name too. So that's the Hector de Jesus. I mean, that's the Jesus comes in, being born on Christmas Day. And Ruiz is my father's last name, and Cárdenas is my mother's last name, which is very common in Mexico and other countries where you take father and mother's last name. But when I came to the U.S. and then eventually became a citizen, it was a nightmare trying to get my name straight, because for some reason the U.S. systems could not accommodate where the names went. So I became I had quite a variety of names, and it began to cause me some problems in things like applying for a driver's license, and things like that. So finally I decided to drop my mother's name and drop the name Jesus, and now I just Hector de J, so I still keep the J because so many legal documents have that. And so that's kind of a long story about the name. And I was born in a small town in Mexico called Piedras Negras, which means black rocks, which is a coal mining town. So that was the main reason for that. And
what part of Mexico is that?
it's in the northern part of Mexico, and there was a time, it's practically right on the border, and across from the border is a small town called Eagle Pass, Texas. Nobody ever knows either one of those two towns, but they were called sister cities because they were right across from each other. And believe it or not, back in those days, they were very friendly cities with each other, which got changed dramatically when immigration became such a hot issue. But so that's a little bit of the.
And you were born on Christmas Day, which must have been quite an event.
What year were you born?
1945.
And Piedras Negras today is good-sized town. Was it smaller then?
Oh yeah, when I was there growing up, my, let's say, teenage years, Piedras Negras had about 25,000 people, and Eagle Pass had about 10,000 people. And so there were two very small towns. But now Piedras Negras is a very large town. And, I mean, in my view, it's large. It's got about 400,000 people. So,
Very large.
But Eagle Pass never grew. Eagle Pass today only has about 25,000. So one side grew a lot and the other one didn't.
And tell me about your family, your parents, siblings, and what were their backgrounds?
Sure. In Mexico, there is an educational system that you go through primary school, which is 6 years, and secondary school, which is 3 years. Both of my parents went through secondary school, and that was it. They didn't go to college or anything like that. And they, frankly, with that level of education, you just took a job, whatever you could do. So both my father and mother did all kinds of things. I mean, they have a very broad experience in jobs. And the last probably, I'm going to say maybe 30 years of their lives, they own a bookstore. So while they were working, they saved enough money to actually open a bookstore, and that was their dream, and they enjoy that. They did that for 30 years or so. You know.
But that was after you had left.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, describe your childhood. What was your neighborhood like? I read in your book that you were shining shoes.
When I was born at home, and I don't have any pictures of that home, but my mother and father used to describe it, and my grandfather used to describe it. They didn't like where they lived because it was just a little one-room cabin in the middle of a desert, pretty deserted. The town is in a desert type of environment, kind of like the Sonoran Desert type of thing. And so it was, by any standards, pretty low in the socioeconomic scale. So as soon as I could, I wanted to help in the house, and so I found out that some of my friends were pretty good at shoe shining, and I wanted to do that. I wasn't as good as they were, but I was enough that I could get around. But I was something that I learned from my parents is to be polite and courteous. And I remember a lot of the American tourists that would come in to Piedras Negras enjoy getting a shoe shine because it was pretty cheap. It was a nickel or something like that. And they always wanted me to do it because they thought I was a good kid, polite and courteous. My other friends were kind of grumpy and they didn't like doing it. So I did that for a while. I mean, obviously I didn't bring a lot of money to the house, but it made my mother feel quite good that I was willing to do something to help, And
you were quite young when you did that.
I was about 6 years old, roughly, But probably, excuse me, and this is hard to describe. Sometimes I'm going to use the analogy you see on TV. Sometimes you see a child has gone through some difficult health issues at the age of 6 or 8, cancer or something like that, and I'm always amazed, and I'm sure you are too, that how mature they are. I mean, the level of maturity these kids have due to that experience. Well, growing up in this very poor little town, I think I was a much more mature 6-year-old than you would find in an American school, for example.
Yeah, my son is 8, and I'm going to tell him what you were doing at that age.
So did you have siblings?
I had 4 sisters. 3 of them are still alive. One of them, unfortunately, passed away with COVID, as a matter of fact, she had some issues that made her immune system compromised, but at the end of the day, it was COVID that got her. But
and are they in the U.S. now, or are they?
Let's see, the 2 are in the U.S., 1 lives in Mexico, Mexico City, as a matter of fact. The one that passed away lived in Mexico also.
And where are you? Are you oldest, middle, youngest?
I'm the oldest.
Okay.
And, I never thought about this until I was older and later in life, that my father probably wanted to have another son. So he kept having kids. But after the 4th one, I think he stopped. But so I have 4 sisters, and I'm the oldest.
So it sounds like, given your parents were interested in a bookstore, that they were education was important to them, reading and so forth. Sounds like I'm guessing that was an important thing. Was that something that they emphasized for you to make sure that you got a good education?
Yeah, and not, they might not have used the word education per se, but I know they were both very insistent that we learn things, And I used to tell people that, my father never traveled anywhere because he couldn't. I mean, that was just not something you did at that level of economics. But if you talk to him about the world, he could almost tell you in a way that you thought he was there, because he read a lot about the pyramids in Egypt. You know, he could tell you how they were, and things that I always was amazed how I thought both my mother and father could almost appear to have been in those places because of the reading they did. So they did a lot of reading. I wouldn't say they were very religious, but they really believed that religion was not a separate part of life, but incorporated in people's lives. So they read a lot about religious history. They knew a lot about that too. And so the name of the bookstore was El Camino Real, which means the Royal Road, and it's really in reference to biblical, passages.
So tell me about your education and what how you progressed, what interests you developed, and I understand you also went to school in the U.S. You went back and forth across the border.
Yeah.
So tell me about sort of that arc of education and how you got steered in a technical direction eventually.
Yeah. Well, starting with the fact that both my father and mother had to work all the time since I was born. But when I was about 5 years old, my mother got an offer to do something that was much higher paying than she had ever had. And she really wanted to do it, but it meant that she had to figure out what to do with me. And I was 5 years old. And as the story goes, I don't remember it well, but there was a teacher that was a friend of my mother's that taught first grade. And she said, why don't I just take him with me? He doesn't have to do anything, but he can sit in the class and I'll babysit and then you can work. And so I ended up doing that. Well, it turned out to be that I really enjoyed being in the class. And the teacher told my mother that I was more ready to do first grade than a lot of the kids that were 7, which was the required age back then. So I ended up staying in school as a result of that. So I was very young in school. So I went through what's called the elementary school, which is 6 years. It was a school called Modelo in Piedras Negras, which means a model school, and it was a public school. And when I graduated from that, again, the same challenge again, trying to figure out what to do financially, it was difficult. Well, it turned out that the church that my parents were going to was a Methodist church. And there was a Methodist school in the town that was private, and they offer a scholarship. And so I went for what's called secondary school. And it was called Instituto del Pueblo. That means the Institute of the People. That was the name. But it was attached to the Methodist church. And so I went to that school, graduated from there. And since you read the book, so probably all this is a kind of an old story for you. But
we're recording it for posterity.
But in trying to attend the school and the connection to the church, I ended up meeting a Methodist missionary whose name was Olive Giving. And she was from a small town in Cadiz, Ohio. And somehow she developed a relationship with me. I could tell she kind of was her protege, She liked what I was doing in school. She started coaching me about education and all that. And she knew that I wanted to be an auto mechanic, that I really enjoy working with cars, which I did. And she convinced me that if I really wanted to be a good mechanic, I would have to learn English, because almost everything that was published about cars was in English. I thought that made sense to me, so she actually tutored me privately to learn English. So I learned enough that I could get by. And so when I graduated from the 9th grade school, she asked me what I was going to do, and I said, well, as I've always told you, I'm going to be an auto mechanic. And he said, well, but you don't know enough yet. He said, you should go to the high school in Eagle Pass, which was across the town. And he said, and that way you'll be better at English and be able to even learn more. And I thought that was kind of difficult thing for me to consider, because that meant leaving my friends and everybody. So it's kind of, may not sound like it going just across the river, but to me it was kind of like, I mean, it's going to another country. I mean, really. And so she convinced me of that. So I went and figured out that the school was willing to take a number of students from Mexico and allow them to attend school so long as you pay $25 a month.
Oh, a
And
month.
A month.
Oh, I thought it was a year. Wow. Okay,
Mhm.
that's a lot.
And it wasn't it doesn't sound like a lot of a big deal, but, for us back then, that was
Yeah,
quite
that
a
was
bit.
a lot.
But Miss Given paid for that. She paid for that. So I went to the high school. And there were about 10 of us that, from that town, that went there. Probably half girls, half boys. And I began to develop a real liking for education at that time. So that was, to me, a pivotal point in my life, is that I met professors who, again, took an interest and started helping me. And probably the first year was the most challenging, trying to adapt to a school where everything was taught in English, and I had to hear English all the time, and it was a little challenging. I made a point in the book that, the first time they asked me to write an essay, nobody wrote essays in Mexico. I mean, that was not something you did, so I didn't know how to do it. So I took my best shot at it, and it was terrible. The professor told me that was the worst thing he ever read. But I began to really enjoy the classes, so I started exposed to physics and chemistry and math, and really liked it. I ended up being valedictorian of the high school, and once again, Miss Gibbon said, "Now, what are you going to do?"
So you wrote in the book, though, that in terms of the actual curriculum, when you arrived, you were quite a bit ahead of the other students in terms of...
Especially in science and math, because the educational system in Mexico, even though it doesn't serve the masses as much as the one here does, it moves faster. And the school year is 10 months versus 9, and it's a little more intense, So when I took my first chemistry and physics classes, things were pretty familiar because I had done all that. And so the same thing with math. And so I found out that gave me, of course, a little bit of an advantage with other kids.
But had you stayed in Mexico and gone to high school there, what was the alternative? What were you choosing by going to Eagle Pass?
After secondary school, there's another school called preparatory school, which is 2 years. And what normally is done is, if you go to preparatory school and actually pass and graduate, then you have to go to university. So the reason it's called a preparatory school is to prepare people to go to college. I didn't do that. I went straight to the high school.
But that would have been academically more rigorous in some ways.
Absolutely. That would have been, I would probably say, similar to junior college, something like that.
So, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, obviously your life, that's a real turning point in your life, because your career ended up being in the States. But I mean, what was your thinking, or what was the importance of going in Eagle Pass? If it was not for better academics, what was it for?
Well, the hook that got me interested was still my interest in auto mechanics, and that I would be much better at understanding the books on auto mechanics if I actually went to the high school and got
Learned English thoroughly. And
better,
right.
And I mean, there was an element of truth in that, because definitely when I graduated from high school, I was much better at English than I was when I started. But then things had begun to change in my mind, begun not so much about the mechanics part, but about education in general. And when back in those days, I don't know if it still exists, every valedictorian of a high school in Texas got offered a scholarship at University of Texas, you know. And I don't know if it's still the case or not, but that was the case back then. And the only conundrum we got into is the fact that I was not a U.S. resident or citizen. I was a foreigner that happened to be graduating from a high school. And so it became a little bit of an interesting dilemma that we had to sort through with help from people so that the law would apply to me, because there was nothing in the way this was written that implied that you had to be a citizen or a resident. It was a loophole, you know. And so I was able to convince the university that I should get the scholarship, which I did. It was called a Good Neighbor Scholarship, you know.
So when you went to the U.S. high school, were you welcomed by the other students? Was there any discrimination, or did the 5 or 10 of you who were from Mexico sort of have your own little group, or did you mix easily with the American children?
Well, you know, that's a good question, because at the time I didn't think of it, but looking back, my wife always asked me, you know, how come I have a lot of friends I went to high school with and you don't have anybody? And I never thought of it until later in life that by coming to high school across the border every day and then going home at the end of the day and spending the weekends at home kept me from developing relationships with other students and other things. So in a way, I lost that social aspect of being in high school. It wasn't obvious to me until later in life that that's why you know, my wife is right, I don't have high school friends. But it was because I was doing that. Now, the positive side of that is it forced me to really pay attention to school, because I had nothing else to do. I mean, I go home and there was no friends to go out with or things, you know, so I studied. And then at that point, that's when, you know, Ms. Gibbons started challenging me again. So why don't you go to the university? Take advantage of the fact that they're going to give you a scholarship. And again, you know, as you know, the scholarship is only a part of the cost. I mean, the tuition and the books and all that is just part of the cost. You had the room and board and all the other things that are more expensive. Once again, Ms. Gibbons agreed to pay for all that for 1 year. She said, I'll do it for 1 year. And
What year did you graduate from Eagle Pass High School?
1964.
Did you feel any sense of discrimination in Eagle Pass? I mean, what was, you say things were much more open and friendly back then, but I mean, were you fully accepted? Did you feel accepted?
Well, I'll divide it into two parts. The professors and the teachers were almost happy to see somebody like me there. I mean, I was embarrassingly, continuously told, they would tell other students, you know, if this kid from Mexico can walk across the border and make 100 on a test, you should be able to do that too. Now, that was not very helpful to me. But so the teachers, I never felt anything from the teachers. If anything at all, I thought they went out of their way to help me. But the counselor ended up being a big problem. Back in those days, I don't know if they still do it, you took an IQ test when you came to school. And coming my first year from Mexico, I have no idea what I was doing, what the test was for, or anything. But I remember I scored so low on the test that the counselor told me that I was in the category qualified as a moron, and that I should not register for math and science and all that I should take shop and mechanics and woodworking and all these things. And I remember thinking, you know, questioning whether maybe it was possible that I wasn't capable, you know. And all I can remember is asking my father, what should I do? And he said, well, what would you like to do? I said, well, I like to take physics and chemistry, because I had taken those in Mexico, and it was fine. And he said, well, then just tell him that you don't agree and that you're going to do it. And so I did. I went back, told Mr. Witt, that was his name, that I was going to do it. And I did, and of course, and, you know, but he was very insistent on, and you know, it could have been, maybe it was some sort of discrimination, but I also think it was also ignorance. I mean, he never, being a counselor, it never dawned on him that maybe the language barrier was causing part of the issues. But so that was the place. Now the student body was different. And it was kind of an odd thing. The white students, so-called Anglo-type students, were somewhat resentful that I was getting more attention than they thought I should get. And so there was a little bit of a sore feeling on that part. Surprisingly, the Mexican kids that were there too, that lived there, were also resentful that somebody that looked like them was getting all the attention too, and all that. So I got caught between those two things, you know, and maybe a saving grace was the fact that I went home every night. I mean, you know, I didn't have to put up with it much after that. But so that I found that interesting, that I didn't belong to either side, and it wasn't, except for the teachers, that, you know.
So this must have been very close. You walked to school from one. You drove.
The last year and a half or 2 years or so, I drove. I had a car. The first year or so, walked across to where there was a place where the school bus would pick kids up.
Oh, I see.
And so I would walk across to where that place was, and I'd get picked up by the school bus.
So when did you decide not to be an auto mechanic and decide that you were going to do something?
Well, you know, when I registered in the University of Texas as a freshman, I was in the school. I thought I was going to be in a mechanical engineering school, you know, and after a semester, either through contact with friends or teachers, I don't exactly know, I found myself drifting towards the electrical engineering piece. And Miss Given was right in her wisdom. Once I got a year under my belt, I was hooked. I mean, there was no way I was not going to get a college degree, and by then, by my sophomore year, I was pretty sure I wanted to be an electrical engineer. You know.
Had you been interested in electronics at all, like radios and the classic, when you were younger?
Only in the sense of, you know, taking them apart and trying to see how they were put together, but not because I thought much about electronics at the time. You know, I remember when I was in elementary school, I mean, there was still no semiconductor industry, you know. So the world was changing as I spent my college years. Technology was just accelerating incredibly fast, you know, in that time.
So you entered University of Texas in Austin?
That's correct.
In 1964?
In 64, yes.
And so you soon switched to electrical engineering. Was there any particular professor or other people who were strong mentors that sort of guided you, or you just sort of rode the
No, there were
wave?
2 or 3 professors that were good. You know, it's probably true today also, but back in those days there was competition among the colleges to get the best students. You know, the electrical engineering people always took pride in saying we have the best engineering students are in electrical engineering. So there was always a competition like that. So there were 2 or 3 professors that were key in helping me make that decision. The one was the chairman of the department, a fellow named Dusterhoft, you know. He took an interest in trying to recruit me, if you can call it that, to be in the electrical engineering curricula. There was a fellow named Dr. Powers, who was from Stanford, actually, and had the same idea. And I started working at the university labs pretty early. I think I was a sophomore when I started working in the labs, and again became more associated with these professors that kept encouraging me to stay there.
And so once you got your bachelor's, what was your view at that time? You were going to go to work? Were you going to stay in the United States? Did you have thoughts about going back to Mexico? Tell me about the transition after that.
At that time, you know, I ended up meeting a wonderful lady in college and ended up getting married when I was a junior. So when I graduated, got my bachelor's degree, I thought the wise thing to do would be to try to get a job.
And she was an American citizen.
Yes. And I did try. As a matter of fact, I interviewed several companies. And I remember to this day how horrified I was about the quality of the jobs they were offering me. I mean, I remember coming home and telling my wife, I can't believe I went to college for 4 years and that's just what they want me to do. And so I was, for example, one of the interviews was with an oil company, and they wanted me to keep an eye on the instrumentation in the oil fields, okay? And while I'm sure that's needed, and that's probably a job that's critical for them, I mean, you had a fellow here that was, you know, an honor student in college and electrical engineering, and that's the kind of job that, and so I was very disappointed. So I told my wife, I said, you know, is there a chance you think we could pull off one more year of graduate school, at least? I thought that might help me find something better. So I stayed at UT for one more year, getting a master's degree in electrical engineering. But during that 1 year, I got exposed to some pretty heavy-duty research at the university and got me more interested in going further. And then I began entertaining the idea that maybe what I really wanted to do was to teach, to be a college professor. And so I got a master's degree from UT a year later. And then in exploring where I should go to get the PhD, I met this professor at Rice, Thomas Rapson was his name, who really wanted me to come to Rice. And it's interesting. It was an interesting professor. The way he chose students is he would interview them like a job, and if he thought there was a match, he would push the school to provide the financial aid to bring the student in. This is where my auto mechanics came back, because he was a car fanatic, you know, that professor, and he had an old Corvette, and we were driving in his Corvette to go to lunch, and I noticed that he was making a funny noise, and I said, I think your timing belt needs to be adjusted. And he looked at me and said, how do you know? I said, well, the sound it makes. I said, I think, long story short, he took it to his shop, and sure enough, it was a timing belt issue. They fixed it, and the car was quiet. That just, to him, was
that sealed
like,
the deal.
I said, I want that guy. So he was instrumental in, you know, I got a fairly generous scholarship to go to Rice and attend that, and so my wife and I moved to Houston.
And back, but your wife had been helping support both of you in Austin?
Yeah, when I was still a senior in college. So my senior year and my first year of master's, my wife was teaching. And
what was her field?
elementary school, elementary education. She taught first grade and loved it. And then when we moved to Houston, she didn't want to give it up. So she actually taught while I was going to school in Houston at the Fairbairn Independent School District, which is on the southwest part of Houston. And I went to Rice for 3 years. And that's where I got my PhD. And in a field that I would have never thought when I was trying to be an auto mechanic, I would have ever thought I was going to do. But I got a feel in high energy lasers, and with the idea that you could create a powerful, which is interesting given today's news. The idea was, can you create a pulse light that's powerful enough to actually induce nuclear fusion? Just
No, it's
And the answer
impossible.
was
It's
wait
impossible.
The answer was wait 60 years, and then yes, right.
And the progress that was made at that time during my years in school trying to do that was minuscule, but it was in the direction that eventually ended up where we are today. And even by today's standards, it's still minuscule. I mean, it's the progress has been. That's one area where the progress has been steady but slow, very slow. So then I graduated, and I wanted to teach. Remember, I said I wanted to teach. So I interviewed schools both in the U.S. and Mexico, and I could never get an offer. I mean, fresh out of college PhDs were not exactly.
This is 72?
72.
That was not a great.
I mean, that was PhD students were driving 18-wheelers because the space program had been watered down, and there were people looking for jobs, and so it was pretty hard. But again, it just so happens that my PhD advisor, my professor, was close friends of the person that was running the research labs at Texas Instruments. And he called him up and said, his name was Norman Einsbruck. Called him up and said, Norman, I have a student here that's one of the best students I've ever had. You really need to hire this guy. and remember, I was working in this field of lights and thermonuclear fusion and all that. Even my master's was in that space. And I went to an interview, gave a talk and they made me an offer to work in material science. And I actually started working at Texas Instruments doing material science work, which had nothing to do with anything I had ever studied.
Right. And you had, this is semiconductor related activity, and you didn't have any background in that.
Nothing. But it didn't take long for me to realize that Fick's law, which is one of the diffusion laws in materials, is exactly the same law as Maxwell's equations. I mean, pretty soon you realize how everything you learned really was applicable, and so that's how I started my career in the semiconductor industry at Texas Instruments, and I was very lucky because that was the decade of the 70s, where TI was the top technology company in the world at the time. So it was, so I was very, very fortunate to be part of that.
And before we talk more about TI, looking back at University of Texas and then Rice, were there many other Mexican students, Latinx students? Who was in your programs, and maybe who was not?
No, there were hardly any that I can remember in that field. There were students in social sciences or arts and sciences and education, but very few I mean, they were rare in engineering. I was unique. The same thing at Rice. I was, I think, I could be wrong, but at the time I think I was the only Latino in the graduate program back then. Now, all of those things have changed dramatically now, but at least in that time.
And not, I presume, very few women as well, right?
Yes, yeah.
And did you feel was there any discrimination in maybe the job offers you were given, or did you have any sense of that?
Not, most there's always that occasional, like, for example, one of the students at UT when I was getting my master's, one of the students was a black student in the same place that I lived. We live in an apartment with my wife, and he was a black student. And he and I decided one day to go get a haircut, and we went to get a haircut at a place that was known for doing the haircuts for all the football players, and so they had football memorabilia everywhere and all that. And I just remember clearly how they wouldn't let that black person go in the barber shop. And so I was aware of things like that. Nothing overtly that I felt towards me at the time. I mean, I experienced that a lot more when I was CEO of AMD than I did when I was going to school.
So we go to the beginning of TI, and that's, the calculator was coming out, and the Speak and Spell was a few years down the road. Anyway,
Yeah, so how did you tell us about how your career evolved at TI and sort of what the major turning points were? And
well, TI had a major problem. I think I started working in July, and by August, just a month later, there was a gigantic problem the company had in the silicon was developing in using material science lingo, stacking faults, and the stacking faults was affecting the performance of the circuits, and the yield was terrible. And so they couldn't figure out what was causing that, and they tried.
This is during the processing of the circuits it developed,
yes,
or was it?
Correct. And so I got a call from my boss at the time, was a fellow named Francois Padovani, he's a Frenchman, and he said, hey, they need somebody to lead a task force to figure out what's wrong. He said, we'd like you to do it. And I remember thinking, geez, I'm not even a material science guy. And so I took on that task of trying to figure out how to.
So you were a brand new employee. You hadn't never managed anybody or anything, right?
I know. So I had to read a lot. I had to become educated a lot as to what stacking faults were, why they happen, how they're created. And it's interesting. I have to say that either they were so brilliant putting somebody that knew nothing, or they just pure luck. I don't know which one of the two. But because I did not know enough about materials, that I started questioning things that nobody ever questioned, And pretty soon I was able to run some experiments that the only way I could run them is in production. I couldn't run them in the lab because you couldn't simulate in the lab the things that I thought was causing the problem. And so I ended up, the only people that would let me run it in production were the people at midnight when they were shifting, from first shift, second shift to third shift. And then they could let me have some of the equipment for a little bit and run the experiments. And I developed a relationship with the floor manager at the time. And I explained to him what we were going to do, what we're trying to prove. And so he took an interest in helping me out. He said, I'll help you. He said, I'll figure out a way to manage enough time so you can have access to the equipment. So we did that, and lo and behold, my assumptions were correct. I was actually able to figure out what was causing the problem. We were able to figure out how to fix it. And it took about maybe 3 to 6 months to do that.
It took a while.
Yeah, and it made such an impact on people in the company and all that, that's where I think you look at inflection point in your life, that was an inflection point in my career because the president of the company at the time said that, give me an award, there's a big deal they made out of it. And he said, why don't you stay in manufacturing? He said, we need people that are educated. Back in those days, the people in manufacturing were not educated, were not trained. And I remember liking it. I mean, I really liked what I had done, and it gave me a sense of accomplishment, instead of working on fusion. that was taken forever. And so I got pretty
So
excited.
like being an auto mechanic of the 20th century.
That's right. So I got pretty excited about being in the manufacturing team. So I did move over to help in manufacturing. And in a matter of time, I became known as somebody who really could fix things. And not easy though, because I remember, I'll give you one example that was amazingly difficult, even though the solution was very simple, but amazingly difficult to convince people. We were running the same product in Dallas, Texas that was being built in Japan. Same exact product, same everything. But the yield in Japan was twice as much as the yield in Dallas. So they gave me the job again of saying, figure out what the problem is. How can
And what
the
year
same
was
plant-
this?
Probably, I'm going to say 75, something like that, mid-70s. And so I went to Japan. I spent 3 months in Japan observing everything the Japanese did, trying to figure it out and all that. And again, similar to the other one, I came up with a theory, an idea. I had to prove it. But I felt pretty confident that was the answer, why their yields were twice as much as ours. So I came back to Dallas and gave a presentation, and the people that were in the room, one of them was Al Stein, but the other one was Morris Chang, who later, of course, became famous running TSMC. But
And what was his position at the time? Do you remember?
he was in charge of the semiconductor business.
Okay, so he was already head of the business.
Yeah,
Okay.
head of the- And the thing that surprised me was that it had not, everybody in Texas was convinced that it had something to do with science, that it had to be the mobility of electrons in Japan for some reason was different. So they had to be something that was scientific. And when I came back and presented the data, that all it had to do was with cleanliness. It had nothing to do with science. That all it was is the Japanese were more careful. They were aware of how difficult it is to keep things pristine and clean, and they were fanatics about it. And it happened to fit their culture very well. So it wasn't like they were doing something difficult, but to them it was natural. They wouldn't allow people to smoke in the fab, whereas we allow people in our
Oh, is that
factories.
right?
Yeah, back in those days, people could smoke in the fab. And so when I presented it, I remember the people in the room just thought it was such a bunch of crap. I mean, it really, they couldn't believe that was doing it. So I told them, let me prove it to you. I said, I can prove it. There's no place to run a clean process in Texas because everything is dirty. I said, but what I'll suggest that we do is split it. Take a material, run it halfway through, and then finish it in Japan. And take a Japanese material, run it halfway through, and then finish it here. And let's compare, and pretty soon it became clear that defect density, and that was when the whole idea of defect density began to be talked about. Prior to that, nobody ever even mentioned it. But then we started looking at defect density, and sure enough, that ended up being the problem. And then it led to a complete restructuring of the factories, how they were, people had to wear now gowns, which prior to that, you came in and your street clothes. And it was, frankly, a high school kid could have figured it out, but it wasn't like it was a big thing. But again, I enjoy doing it, even though it wasn't, I didn't have to solve many difficult equations or anything like that.
And which one worked better, with starting in Japan, finishing in Texas, or
Well,
which had
back in those days, they had test chips that you could do, and what we did is we were able to prove that the material that got started in Japan, the test chips were far better than the ones that were started in Texas. And then when we flipped them, we could then prove that the ones that were better in Japan got destroyed when they got finished in Texas. And whereas the ones that were done in Texas never changed when they went to Japan. They stayed as good, just as good. And again, I learned back in those days, because there was not a lot of educated, by educated I don't mean that in any derogatory way, I just mean formal training, education did not exist in manufacturing. It became pretty easy for me to really be able to help and contribute in a manner that people were surprised, you know.
So this was in mid to late 70s. It wasn't until the 1980s where there was a big hoopla about Japan yields and DRAMs and that kind of thing. But it sounded like you were onto this.
That's right.
In the mid 70s. So if you just look at that sort of trend, I mean, how did that affect TI? Because the rest of the industry was sort of in the dark, it seemed like, until the 80s.
Well, I thought that made a huge impact on TI, being able to, you know, if you look at the history of the company, the 70s was the best days, boom times for TI they ever had. And I think a lot of that was a contribution of understanding how to build things better than others at the time, you know. When the reason Alstein took me out of TI to go to Motorola was exactly because of those things. Motorola was even worse than TI was in terms of not knowing how to run a semiconductor factory. I mean, it was really terrible, and it's amazing.
Before going on, can you summarize quickly what was the fault that you solved the first time around at TI, the stacking?
Stacking faults?
Yeah.
When you look at a silicon crystal, you know, they're all grown by different methods, but let's just take one method, the Cherkassky method, which is you dip a seed on the molten silicon and then pull it out, and you grow this crystal, and it normally is round, but it's not perfectly round. So what people have to do, they have to grind it to get it to be perfectly round, and then they cut it into slices, and you get those round silicon slices that are used. My hypothesis was, well, what if when we grind it, we're damaging the crystal, and then when we heat it up to process it, stacking faults are like defects. They move. I mean, they actually move around like a piece of dirt. And I said, what if that's causing the thing? The stacking faults move. And so what we ended up doing were two things to be able to fix it. First of all, we proved that it was, and then we fix it by, you do an etch on the crystal before you cut it into slices. So you grind it, and then you etch it. The etching relieves the stress on the edges of the crystal. That was one piece. The other piece was, instead of heating the wafers in the furnace like we used to, then we started ramping the heat so that it would heat slowly. Then we had to calculate how to make that the equivalent of what we were doing before in terms of diffusion, so you don't end up with a different. But so then, and that's when equipment companies began to copy from TI the electronics to control the ramp and the ramp down and cool down. So that came from that. And the boats that wafer used to sit in, little boats in the furnace, were poorly designed, so that they actually create stress where the wafer was sitting. So we had to redesign those so that as the wafer was heated, the stress was minimized. When you did all that, the thing completely disappeared, like magic.
So were there other major developments during your career at TI, and what position did you move into before then? Sounds like you moved on to Motorola, but sort of finish off the story with TI.
When I spent during my career, I started in the research labs, the corporate research labs, and when they moved into manufacturing, I ended up staying there. And I was what they called back in those days, they call a device manager. You know, I was supposedly in charge of making sure that the processes and testing that was done on devices was, as good as you could do. And we had, for example, we had a famous microprocessor back in those early days called a TMS 1000. Yeah. And that was one we used because we had the most knowledge on it, how to learn from it, how to do things so that we could yield better and all this sort of thing. And so I stayed doing that for quite some time. And a lot of troubleshooting in the company. Every time there was an issue, I would help troubleshoot. Then TI became really involved in making calculators, and that's another place where we had to figure out how do you test these things so that they're doing, even though it was very simple back then, it was, the 4 basic functions of arithmetic, but we had to figure out a way to test them. So we did a lot of interesting work in terms of figuring out what is the best way to do that. And this is going to sound nowadays kind of ridiculous, but what we did is we just divided 1 by 3 in the calculator, and you display it. And if you got 0.33333 in the whole calculator, the probability of that chip being good was like 99.9%, something like that. So we did a lot of very interesting things that seemed simple, but made it easy for people to do the work and test it. And then I got involved in a couple of task forces, one of them with a calculator. I was in a calculator task force where, I don't know if you remember, it was called data math, the calculator, and it was about this big, and all it did is the 4 arithmetic functions and sold for $150 back in the 70s. I mean, you think about it.
Real money then, huh?
And you kind of go back, really? Back then? But it ended up being a phenomenal, successful product the company made. Got involved also in a task force where TI was trying to get into the memory business. And TI's product was called a 4064, was a 4K RAM, but it didn't compare to the MSEE 4K RAM, which was a 4027. And I was put on the task force to figure out how to copy it. How do you reverse engineer a product, copy it? So I learned a lot about, how do you reverse engineer, which back then was considered a sophisticated product. 6 masking steps. Compare that today, which today people now, I think they're up to 400 now, masking, So while doing all that, that's when the opportunity came to go to Motorola.
What about the transition from bipolar to MOS? TI was huge in bipolar with the TTL family and all. Had to move into MOS with the calculator, and I don't know if that was the leading product or whatever, but were you involved in that and helping develop and refine the MOS processes?
I always worked in MOS. I never did much in bipolar other than try to kill it. I thought that was a mistake for the company to continue. I think, when I look back, the beginning of the end of TI being the #1 company in the world was their obsession with bipolar. I don't know if you remember, the TI had a watch.
Yeah.
Okay, and the watch was a bipolar watch, and it was LED.
LED display. You have to
LED
push
display.
the button to see.
We have one
You do.
in the,
And
in the exhibit.
it didn't. The battery didn't last very long. It was it consumed too much power, and for whatever reason at the time, it was very difficult to convince management that it was a bipolar circuitry that needed to be switched over to MOS, and it was not done.
Well, they were making so much money in bipolar, right? That was a hard thing to give up.
Yeah. So it's so I played a peripheral role on that, not as directly involved. And of course, there was a group of people that were working in MOS early that left the company to start Mostek, which became a pretty big company at the time, driving the MOS technology.
So you were still in manufacturing or related to manufacturing and test and so forth when you moved over to Motorola.
Yes.
And why did you move?
Well, it's like things like Yogi Berra says, you get a fork in the road, you got to take something, you got to go one way or the other. I had made it clear to people that, and there's a reason, I'll interject a little to explain why. It's in the last couple of years of my time at DI when my first wife passed away, and so I ended up remarrying the person that's now my current wife,
And you had children already as well.
Yes. And so one of the things she and I thought is, it would be great. She had her set of friends. I had my set of friends. Her husband had passed away, so she was a widow, and I'm a widower. I said, wouldn't it be nice if we could find a job somewhere where we could develop our own friends? We have our own life in a different way. So I passed the word around TI that I really wanted to be assigned to an offshore assignment if I could. So I passed the word around. That word got to Al Stein at Motorola. And so, because he knew that, he called me up and said, we need to build a factory in Scotland. How would you like to go and be the guy that builds it? And I remember discussing it with my wife and thought, it's a perfect fit. Gives us a chance to, start developing our own different life and all that, and it'd be great. And so I decided to take that. Now, in the middle of that, of course, Morris Chang, who was the boss at the time, said, no, you can't do that. He said, if you really want an assignment, I'll put you in charge of a factory in France. TI had a factory in Nice, France. And he said, beginning Monday, you can move to France and, it kind of really rattled me for a while because, Nice, France was a lot nicer than Northern
Yeah, I was about to say Nice, Scotland.
but it made me think about it, that they knew all along that I wanted to do this. And I felt like, it just didn't seem right to not do what we originally thought. So with some agony, I decided to leave TI because I really enjoyed it. It gave me an awful lot of learning. I learned a lot. I think it was one of the best things I ever did in my life, in my career. So it was hard. It wasn't easy.
What year was this that you left and went to Motorola?
78, I think.
I'm sorry?
78.
78, okay.
Yeah. And so I left, joined Motorola, spent a little time in Motorola, moving around in the U.S., getting to know people. And then in early 79, moved to Scotland. And I built the MOS facility there and enjoyed it tremendously.
Now, was there any semiconductor infrastructure in Scotland at the time? It was
a little bit, not zero, but it was, not great, but it was.
Seems like that's very difficult. All the gases and all the
right
technology and how you build things, and must have been a challenge.
It was a challenge, but what made it easier to respond to the challenge was that the Scottish people are very proud. And when I went over there, I said, look, they're going to measure us like crazy. I said, they're going to compare us to everything. I said, so the only thing we can do to not be shut down, practically, is to make sure we always do better. And it really motivated the people. And we were building back then the 68,000 microprocessor. And Scotland, the factory in Scotland was actually yielding better than any factory in the U.S. And
where in Scotland was it built?
It's right outside Glasgow. There's a suburb called East Kilbride.
Oh yeah, okay, East Kilbride, right.
Yeah, and they were really proud of it. They felt good, and it was quite an exciting time for the whole family too. To tell you what a positive impact he had on the family. My daughter was, it was my wife's daughter, but it's our daughter now. Our daughter was 12 years old when we moved there. It was a difficult time to move.
Yeah.
When she got married, all her bridesmaids were from Scotland. So she made a lot of very close friends, you know. So if you ask my wife what's the best time in our joint careers, she'll tell you Scotland, the Scotland assignment. So.
And what's her career?
My wife?
Yeah.
She went to North Texas to study home economics. And she never really had a paying job. She reminds me a lot that she worked just as hard as I did but never got paid. But, you know, she spent all the time raising kids and doing community work.
And between the two of you, how many children did you have?
We had 3. I had 1 and she had 2. Yeah.
And did Scotland give subsidies for, was there like, because I know that Scotland at various points more in the 80s was trying to recruit people to their industrial parks, various firms.
There were, but you know, it's amazing how rapidly things have changed, where the subsidies that Scotland offered back in those days appeared to be substantial. Today they're peanuts compared to subsidies being offered today around the world are in the billions, you know, many billions. I mean, back then it was like $200,000-300,000, you know, and we thought it was a lot. But so it was a great experience.
So how long did you spend there, and were there, you know, once you got it up and running, did you continue, or was that job done and you moved on, or?
My plan was I would stay there as long as they needed me, you know. But when we got the factory running and it was yielding well and doing a good job, I got then asked to move to Phoenix, Arizona, and fix the factory that was built in the 68,000, because the one in Arizona could not yield, you know. And so we moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and I ran the factory, which back then was called MOS 5. It's a great factory, but it just had, again, back to the TI experience, you know, the things that we're doing. I mean, I'll give you one example. Operators were being hired without knowing how to read or write English, you know. And think about that. How can you work in a state-of-the-art factory? That was the most modern factory Motorola had back in those days, the one in Phoenix. And these people would make mistakes, like they would grab the wrong acid, you know. It was terrible. So, but changing those things that have been done for some time is very difficult, more difficult than any technical issue I've ever dealt with. Because what I wanted to do is, I didn't want to hire anybody that did not speak or write English well. And the HR organization was up in arms because he said, there's nothing in the spec for the job that says it's required to be proficient in English. And I said, well, change the damn spec. And it was the biggest obstacle I had in trying to do those things was the HR organization, you know. And I mean, nowadays you think about it, you think, wow, how could you not?
So if they were not speaking English, were these Spanish-speaking people?
There were people, Arizona people that just didn't speak. It's not that they didn't. I mean, they could order coffee and ham and eggs at the restaurant, but they couldn't.
They weren't fluent.
They weren't fluent, and so. But it took time to finally we convinced. We were the first company in the U.S. to actually test people to work in the factory, and it was. We had to convince the Department of Labor that this was necessary and all that. But once we started doing that, you know, everything began to change. Yeah.
How long did it take you to get that yields up to standard in that factory?
Well, I started. I would say that it was probably about 2 to 3 years.
A long process.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's these things are,
Cultural change.
cultural change is really difficult. And
Sorry, Finn.
sure,
How long were you in Scotland, though?
a little over 2 years.
Okay.
So you got that factory up and running pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, it was a small, it wasn't like the factories you see today. They're just massive. I mean, it was a small factory. Probably the capacity was minuscule compared to what people do today. But
And this is the 68,000 in the earliest days. I mean, who was buying them at that point? I mean, Sun was later and Apple was much later.
well, the big customer was Apple. Yeah.
Already?
Yeah.
Well, the Mac was introduced in '84, but
Now, by big,
Lisa
back in those
before
days,
that.
it's not a lot of chips, but the 68,000 family was quite spread out in the networking space. And the very first humongous customer was Apple,
So that, and
Yeah.
with the Mac, it was the first one to use
Yeah.
that chip.
so you went to Scotland in '79 and came back in '81ish.
Yeah, right,
Okay. So Arizona was right
And then
as the
Arizona.
Mac started.
correct.
So you got this. So were you in charge of this factory in Phoenix for 2 or 3 years? For longer? How long? Tell me about your career arc at that point.
I should be able to remember those days exactly, but I was probably in that factory maybe for 18 months, and then there was a reshuffling in the company. It happens, once in a while, triggered by Al Stein departing the company at the time.
Yeah. So he left in '82, March
Yeah,
of
something
80
like that.
Oh well, actually, it's before that because he went to Arrow, so it would have
Yeah.
been in.
So he
81
left the
probably.
company, and people got moved. And as that happened, I ended up being promoted to run all the factories for Motorola. So then I had to move to Austin because that was where the center of gravity was for all the factories. So I moved to Austin, Texas in '81, I think, more or less, give or
Yeah.
take a little bit. And then I was not responsible for all manufacturing, in the semiconductor space. And again, I wasn't pursuing that because actually my wife and I really loved the Arizona desert. So it was really difficult for us to leave Arizona, but again, the possibility of actually being able to contribute even at a more intense level was, to me, the attraction was I could make a bigger impact only on one factory. Now we can do it in many factories, And it was probably one of the most challenging assignments that I had at the time,
So at this point, you had a much larger organization.
Yeah. And with it came the research labs too. So I had the manufacturing and research, So it was pretty good size.
How many people roughly were you overseeing?
Probably 10,000 people, something like that, roughly.
So you must have been there for quite some time at Motorola.
I was there for 22 years.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, and was this? How did things evolve? Can you sort of quickly summarize? We'd
Sure.
like to move on to the AMD story, but I don't want to miss anything in terms of Motorola.
No, I left to do the factory in Scotland. I went to Phoenix to fix the factory in Phoenix that was built in 68,000. Then I was in charge of all manufacturing and R&D. We put in place, back in those days, there was a consulting firm. I think the name was Thompson. I'm not sure if I got the name right, but it became known in the semiconductor industry. We hired them at that time on an interesting deal that looking back, it was a brilliant thing to do. Is our yields were okay, but not great. Our cycle times were okay, but not great. Our inventory management was okay, but not great. So we said, why don't we get some help from these people and see if we can get them to do it for a portion of the cost we're going to save. Like, for example, if we cut cycle time in half, that means we have less inventory. And there's a cost associated with that. So we see we can track all this cost and then pay them a percent of that, the savings. And my finance guy at the time loved it because we didn't have to pay anything unless we actually,
Pay for
it's
results.
a 10 to 1, So
Right.
if we save $10, they get 1, we keep 9, and he thought it was a great deal. I thought so too, by the way. And so they brought in a lot of people, very smart people. They helped us figure out where all the spots were that we had to fix and change. And over a period of about 2 or 3 years, we changed dramatically cycle times, inventory management, all that stuff. And the savings were so big that all of a sudden my CFO said, damn, we're paying too much. And we stopped it mostly because the finance organization was supposed to pay in that much. But it worked. It actually worked. And that's when we were, I think at that time Motorola probably was peaking as a company that was a major player in the semiconductor space and began to peak. I think there were a lot of great things being done and a lot of great people. Then I get a call out of the air, just out of sky, out of nowhere, from the CEO of the company. At the time was a fellow named George Fisher. And he said, I'd like you to go to Florida and run one of our communication business. And I went back to, I know nothing about communication, never been close to a communication device and all that. I said, really? I said, yeah. I said, and the sooner the better, and so again, my wife and I got together, packed, because we had only been in our house for like 18 months.
What year was this?
This was in 90. And so I moved to Florida. We moved to Florida.
Oh.
And I ran what was back then known as the paging division. I don't know if you know
Back
what
when we had
pagers
pagers.
are. But
Yeah.
We have them in the exhibit.
but it's, back in the days, it was a hot product. I mean, and again, sometimes people ask me, well, why were you able to see the things you needed to do? And I think probably the best answer I can ever give is that I was so curious all the time. I was filled with curiosity. I mean, I know they say curiosity kills the cat, but it also is, it helps you see things that and what I mean by that is when I took over the paging division, they didn't want to sell products in China. And I said, I don't understand why. I said, well, the Chinese don't speak English. It's Chinese characters, how can you make, how can a pager work? And I remember thinking in a brainstorming session with engineers, I said, there's a huge market in China that would love to have pagers, but here's the obstacle. What do you guys think? And I'll never forget this one engineer raised his hand and he said, well, just display Chinese characters. And I said, well, aren't they kind of complicated? He said, no. I said, the electronics doesn't know that you're displaying a character. They don't care. I said, really? I said, yeah. So we mocked up a few pagers to see if it was possible. Sure enough, it was. So we ended up making, it was called an advisor. That was the name of the pager. And it had a big screen so that the characters could be displayed better because, the Chinese characters are complicated. And we had to also create the machine that creates the code that goes into over the air so that the pager could receive the code and turn it into a Chinese character. Long story short, that product became so hot that one day I got a call from a person in Miami who ended up being a bad person. But he offered me $10 million in a Swiss account if I would let him have the pagers that we were making for China go through him, you know. And it said, nobody will ever trace it. Of course, I immediately turned that over to our security people and figure out. But it gives you an idea how hot that product became. I went to China to see what was going on, and the line of people waiting to get a pager went for blocks. Just standing in line waiting to get a pager. And you think about, this is where I began to learn at that time. That was my first time I learned the importance of understanding the market, because we were lucky. Because what we didn't understand is that the Chinese didn't have any way of communicating back then. And so if somebody is delivering bread to a particular place, but the person that's buying it doesn't need it, but another person needs it down the road, you could page that person. And that person in a bike with, you know, 1,000 loaves of bread would immediately know to go in a different direction. That was so productive to those people that they would line up. No. And so I was there for 5 years. Loved it. I mean, that was the best, in terms of my best job I've ever had, that was by far the best job I've ever had, because it was hidden in Florida. Nobody cared about it. The CEO of the company didn't pay attention to it. We could do anything we wanted to, and made a lot of money. I mean, we.
So why did George Fisher want you to go down there? Were there problems that you had to go solve? Or?
No, what he told me at the time, and I think he was right. I think he said, we're going to put you on a track to be a candidate for the CEO of the company. And to do that, you need to become familiar with the communication business. And this is the easiest way to do it. Paging was not as complex as a radio. And he was right. I mean, I learned an awful lot. And it was a great experience. I was supposed to be there for 2 years, and this is the first time that I overshot my assignment. I ended up being there for 5. And
so you went there in 90?
90.
And then 95.
But 95.
Were there any other major developments? I mean, obviously things went very well, but entering the Chinese market was a major step. Is there any other?
Well, this is, and I feel bad in a way, because I think this indicated to me that Motorola was beginning to lose its edge in the market. Because back in those days, Motorola was the #1 company in cell phones, the #1 company in two-way radios, like for police force, security, etc. And definitely, we had 90% of the market on the paging business. I mean, that was huge. But then we came up with an idea in paging with the engineers that said, you know, why don't we combine paging and cell phones so you could text, you know? And we went and presented that to corporate, and they just couldn't, there's no way they could even accept that we would interfere with the cell phone business, because they were doing so well. But if you think about it, what do people use a phone for today? You text more than you talk, you know? But somehow we had people that actually could see that, but we could not convince them. And to me, that was a bad sign. That was a big red flag that came up that said, you know.
We have a major exhibit downstairs about the rise of text and the fact that nobody saw it coming.
Well, but that was, the GSM people, that they had an internal battle to get texting put into GSM. Were you aware, though, of, you must have been aware of texting happening in the GSM world?
Well,
it was just starting.
I got exposed to texting the first time, and most people missed it. I don't know if it's in your museum or not, but the Japanese were texting long before anybody else was. And when we saw that, we in paging thought, why don't we we had the technology for texting already developed pretty well. And we said, why don't we tell the cell phone people that they could incorporate that in their systems very easily, and then you could text on a cell phone, you know. But it was, I mean, it was dead on arrival, as they say. You could never
Now, in texting or in paging, did you see that? I mean, you must have seen the cell phone as a threat to that business. I mean, it was a
Well, we knew it, in our view was, since they didn't want to do it, we said, well, let's do it ourselves, and we came up with a two-way pager. I don't know if you remember that. There was a two-way pager where you actually could send a page to somebody and the person could respond, and it looked like a little shell, a clamshell that opened up like that, and it had a keyboard, and we sold a lot of those, and to me, a sign that it was beginning to take as a device people wanted was that when you got on an airplane, the flight attendant would say, "Please turn off your two-way pagers." To me, that was a sign.
that was a great sign.
That was a sign that things had really worked, and to me, it was an excellent technology, excellent device. But it definitely was better to have been part of the phone, because people don't want to carry two devices.
Yeah.
But when did Japan start texting then? Maybe it is earlier than I knew.
We saw texting on phones in Japan. You had to be in the early 90s.
Okay, but already digital
Yes.
phones, not analog, and but not dedicated two-way pagers in Japan.
The two-way pagers were launched in the marketplace probably in 94, 95.
Okay,
You know?
and the when you were doing the Chinese characters, were you just rolling your own, or was there, were there existing ways of representing the character set that you could adopt, or were you just
There were what we normally call a typewriter in China that people would use to create Chinese characters. So we just took that technology and adapted it to digital, and so you could create the characters. And as I'm sure you know, the device doesn't care. It's just getting ones and zeros and interprets them and makes it the Chinese character.
But you were coming up with your own scheme for that.
Right.
So it's the typewriters are based on strokes. Or no. But okay. But you were, Unicode didn't unify a lot of this for quite a while afterward. So that you were coming up with your own method for representing.
Correct. And back in those days, in paging and in cellular phones, when Motorola was leading the way, we created a whole system. It wasn't just the handheld device. We created the infrastructure for doing the work of sending the signal over the air, and when you own the whole system from one end to the other, then you have a lot more freedom of how to, for example, create the Chinese character pager.
So you were there for 5 years. What was the next step?
Again, another reshuffling occurred. George Fisher left the company, so he went to become the CEO of Kodak. And in the reshuffling that happened, the semiconductor business opened up the general manager for semiconductors, and I was asked to go back home, as people told me back then. Said, "Hector, it's time for you to go back home, to go to the semiconductor side and run the semiconductor business." And that was in about 96, more or less, roughly 96. And so the person running it before me was a fellow named Tommy George. And so I ended up taking his place.
So you went back to Austin?
I went to Austin. Since the company moved me around so many times, and my wife was getting really tired of it, I said, only if the headquarters of the semiconductor business can be in Austin, that'll make sense. I can't move to Phoenix again. I said, it's just too much on the family. And we did that. And shortly after taking over is when it became obvious to me that we had to sell the discrete business, which ended up creating On Semiconductor today, because we were getting distracted. We were trying to move down the path of, which was very challenging, of microprocessor technology. And we had these discrete businesses that was healthy, making business, but it was a distraction. And so we ended up selling it, divested it of it, and created On Semiconductor. And from everything I can tell, they have been very successful.
So you went back in '96 or so, and how did that evolve?
It seems like every time I went somewhere, I began to see a pattern that, good or bad, that's just the way I ended up growing up, is that I was never happy being a transactional manager. It just never felt right. I think if they had offered me a position where it was obvious that that's what I had to be, then I would have had to say there's probably somebody better that can do that. So I was always looking for what could we do that could transform the company better. So in the lingo of consultants, I'm more prone to be attracted by transformational leadership than I am by transactional. So as soon as I got there, I saw a lot of things that could be very strong for the company if we could do them. One of them was divesting of discretes. That was a very difficult thing to sell because every executive in the company almost went through being a discrete manager at one point or another. So there was a love affair with.
But he had some ownership of that.
Yeah, and it was difficult, but I was finally able to do it, and so we were able to divest it. And then I thought we were not serving our customers well, so I felt another thing we had to do is be more focused on customers and markets than on products. For example, I felt that we needed to understand the automotive industry better rather than have a product we created and then try to convince the automotive industry they should use it, because there was the mismatch. And it became pretty clear to me that wasn't working, that we had to figure out some way that we could do that. And so I needed a restructuring that probably was very challenging on people. Instead of being organized by microprocessors, memories, etc., we got organized by automotive, computing, etc., even though we had a platform that could go across. Right. So I made engineering and design be a horizontal structure, and the market customer-driven be a vertical structure. And that was tough. And if I had to do it over again, I would do it differently, but it's still the same thing. And the different part was, you can't turn, like the old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I tried to make that work with the people that were there. And there was a lot of, not necessarily evil or mean, but sort of a subjective undermining of making it work. So making it very, very difficult. And but despite that, we still ended up, I was able to bring the company to the sales level I had before we got rid of discretes. So we made up for the loss, and we actually achieved more profitability as that got implemented than we had before. But it was hard. It was really, really hard.
So what kind of pushback did you get?
More from the people I had done it. For example, there were 3 or 4 very key players in the semiconductor business that as soon as I explained that I wanted to do that, they quit, And it really, I felt somewhat that I wish I had had the support of the corporation to not let them quit, make them work, but they didn't, and part of it was that by that time, George Fisher had left, and I think he would have probably been a lot more supportive of trying to help me make it work So I felt that was a missed opportunity, because I think there are things we could have done, differently. And then when it became clear to me that the company really wanted to focus on communications and really make communications the banner of the company, which I agree, but I think that was the smart thing to do. Then it became clear that maybe the semiconductor business should be spun off, and I started the process to do it. It didn't get finished under my watch, but shortly after I left, Motorola spun off the semiconductor business into a separate company. Freescale, yes. And then Freescale got acquired by the European company. What was the name? That escapes me right now.
I lost track. I knew
Yeah.
about Freescale. I don't know.
Yeah, Freescale got acquired by a European company. I think-
Is it ST or
No,
um,
no. It was a
Siemens?
German, Dutch company, Philips.
Oh, Philips.
Philips, sorry. It got acquired by Philips, and they've done fine.
Yeah.
I mean,
Philips
but-
acquired VLSI Technology too.
yeah. So, but I thought that if, in my view, if the company had the stomach to focus on the things that were doing well in semiconductors, it could have been a good company and done a good job. I think the architecture they had was good, could be developed further into a much futuristic architecture, but it required significant investments. And the deal, we don't remember the exact number, but I think when we sold this discrete business, we sold it for approximately 1.7 billion, something like this, or 1.5. And the idea was that I was going to use that to refurbish our semiconductor position and make it stronger. And at the last minute, that got changed, and the corporate took all the money. And so I ended up not having the cash that I thought I was going to have. And so it made it difficult.
So the restructuring was done without that cash that you were
Right.
expect. And did the fact that you were based in Austin, I mean, did being in a separate place make a difference also? I mean, did that make it more difficult?
You mean a
Because
different?
only the semiconductor division was based there, right?
Correct, only semiconductor, yes.
So, I mean, you're doing this huge restructuring away from a lot of the other.
No, but within the semiconductor business, I mean, it's not.
Yeah, everybody else in the company is somewhere else. Austin was only semiconductor. And in the process of doing all these things, we were trying to also do something pretty creative. This leads into your question a little bit, is that MCUs, the microcontroller products that we had, were very successful, very, very successful. But if we could figure out a way to put flash on them, would really change the game completely. But flash technology is not quite compatible with the technology you use to build a microcontroller. So we approached AMD and said, you guys have flash. Do you think we could do a joint effort where, we can develop the technology in such a way that you benefit, we benefit, and we did. We signed a deal to jointly develop flash so that we could put it on microcontrollers, and it was a combination of cash and technology agreements that led to that. And then I got to know Jerry, and in that discussion, while all of the rest of the stuff is going, all the restructuring, everything is going at the same time. One day he just brought up the idea of saying, hey, the board wants me to get a replacement lined up. I said, why don't you get a real job? Typical of Jerry, why don't you get a real job and come and join us? And I thought about it. And in the midst of all the stuff that was going on about where semiconductors stood in the company at the time and everything, made that decision a little bit easier, you know.
So from that point to when you actually joined AMD, what was that period of time? And
I think I ran the semiconductor business for probably 3+ years, something like that. And that's when Jerry approached me.
And remind me what time frame. When did you join AMD?
In January of 2000.
January 2000. So you were running the semiconductor business from mid-90s to 2000.
Yeah, probably 97 to 2000, something
Okay.
like that.
Okay. So before we move to the discussion on AMD, can you just recount for us how and when the decision was made to start moving in the direction, anyway, of spinning out the semiconductor? What was the forcing function? Was there a particular event or conversation or meeting, strategic meeting, where we said we need to spin this out? And what was the driving force? What was the key thing that said we need to make this happen?
At some point in time, it was, I want to say, it had to be around the 96, 97 time frame. We made an analysis of the future of the semiconductor industry and the place where we thought Motorola would have a significant strategic advantage over any competitor, where we could play a big role in all that. And when you do the math, the resource required to do that was pretty significant. And I felt the corporation would find it very difficult to support two things that were not yet, in a position to accomplish the things they needed to accomplish. One was the semiconductor piece and the future of communications. Everybody in Motorola was becoming a little uncomfortable with the two-way radios and cell phones as we knew them were not going to be the future. Something had to change. People started talking about the convergence of computer and communications, blah, blah, blah. And so there was definitely an effort going there. And also, if you remember, that was a time when Motorola made a huge investment in Iridium, trying to put all the satellites and all that. And again, that was an effort to see if they could create a future that was different. Then you had the semiconductor piece, which when you look at the resources needed to achieve what we thought was possible, it was huge. I mean, it was gigantic. And then the question began, and I wanted people to acknowledge that if we couldn't do that, then I didn't see the point of being a broad player in the semiconductor industry. You had to either go find a niche that you'd be good at, and as Jerry Sanders used to say, niches are for roaches. Nobody wanted to do that, and so it became, even though maybe people didn't say it aloud, it became clear that a divestiture of the business had to be considered, and so we began to do all the work, began to get consultants involved, investment bank figuring out.
And was this well known within the semiconductor sector? I mean, did it make people nervous?
No,
or did it,
there was a number of people incorporated in the semiconductor sector that knew we were having those discussions, but there was not a broad discussion outside. I mean, we didn't think that would be valuable, at the time.
Alternatively, you may not. Yeah. The word would leak out, and people would start talking. Right?
But it was a good exercise to go through. We felt like it was important to at least know this is what we think would happen if we stay. This is what I think is going to happen if we don't. And from my point of view, I think it became pretty clear that Motorola couldn't support two major thrusts at the size that the company was. You know, you can do it if you're Samsung. I mean, you're so big. you can go into the automotive business if you want to. You know, you're so giant. But the size of the company and the resources required, and in the and with the management team in place that had grown with the company from the beginning, it became clear that a divestiture of the semiconductor business had to be considered. And then the decision was made after I left.
All right, so let's talk about the courting process. Had you met Jerry Sanders before this discussion about cooperation and non-volatile memory, or?
No, I hadn't met him. We approached him. We actually approached them because we really needed the flash on MCUs, and we were struggling trying to figure out how to do it. And we thought that might be a good way to. They had good products, good flash technology, and so we started working with him. You know, sign a deal and put teams together to work at both sites. And I think it was going well. I think we began to see some very encouraging signs. And it was sometime in the late fall of '99 when Jerry challenged me, basically. I mean, he literally said, you know, you don't really have a job. I said, you work for somebody else. They tell you what to do. You know, Jerry. Why don't you come here and
the typical Jerry subtle side,
yeah,
right?
So. And I thought about it. You know, it was a genuine desire on his part to bring me on board, and
so
I
let me
thought-
ask. He said the board had said I need to find someone to take my place or whatever.
Yeah.
Did Jerry want to do that, or was this?
My thinking was that the board felt that Jerry was getting close to retirement, to a place in his life where maybe he wanted to do something else, and that they were uncomfortable that there was not an obvious person to step in. If that happened, they would have to recruit somebody. And rather than do that, they said, why don't we recruit him now? And Jerry had a very talented HR person, a fellow named Stan Wimvik, who really, truly understood the value of having someone, you know, not necessarily come in as the CEO, but come in and work with Jerry for a year or two and be able to step in at the right time. So between Stan and Jerry, they worked hard on me for a while. And I told them I would make a decision over the Christmas holidays, because that was '99. And again, this is another place where we've only been in the house 18 months, this particular house. And so we talked about it, and this is the one time that my wife said, you know, you need to do what you think you want to do for your career. The kids are grown, we don't have anybody home, but I don't want to move. So that was the first time that we actually, and I was able then to explain it to AMD that it would be helpful for me to stay in Austin. AMD had a huge presence in Austin anyway. As a matter of fact, the presence in Austin was quite a bit bigger than the presence in California already, but you know, before I came on board. So and then I'll be happy to go back and forth. And we agreed to that. And so in January, I decided to do that.
So your style and Jerry's style, pretty different personalities, and
I'd say.
did you think that did that provide some misgivings either in working for him or running the company that had been molded in his image?
Yeah, and not so much that I had any trepidation about Jerry himself. The trepidation was about the fact that history is filled with anecdotes of people taking over a founder and having very challenging times doing the things that he or she would like to do. And that's apparently just normal human, trajectories. a founder, especially somebody that had been as long with the company as, Jerry was with the company for 30 plus years.
And such
So-
a strong personality
Yeah.
and everything. I mean,
and I mean, to his credit, the fact that he even wanted to bring somebody was a sign that he was willing to share. But just there was trepidation, and when Morola was trying to talk me out of leaving, they made me aware of a lot of other things that happen when when somebody takes over a founder.
Right.
And so I went into it knowing that there was a lot of things that might not work, So, but I was willing to give it a shot, and.
And how was the role divided up? What piece of the company? So what responsibility did he have? He stayed as CEO, right? You were president.
Correct.
So what did he have some of the functions reporting to him, and was that a issue or not? Or?
We had probably, I think, a situation that was tailored to both of us. I mean, he felt that I was probably strong in the operational side, having run a very large semiconductor operation. When I left Motorola Semiconductors, it was about an $8 billion company. Had about 30,000 employees. So that things that had to deal with that, I think he felt pretty comfortable that I would do. The things that were probably more difficult for him to begin to let go were sales and marketing, as an example. I think that was probably the place where he felt the most comfortable. But I think we had a unspoken relationship where pretty much anything he or I wanted to do, we could do and communicate it. No matter what I did, I always communicated, and he did the same thing. So the boundaries were not tightly aligned, tightly delineated, and defined. And there was a understanding that if you had to speak to Wall Street, for example, it's a lot easier for Jerry to speak to Wall Street than it would be for me, because they know him, they expect him, And so we had that relationship, which I felt was working well.
So what was the biggest surprise, positive or negative, or surprises coming in? You expected to find X and you found Y. What were there any big negative surprises? Boy, you thought you were X and
No,
yeah.
the thing, first of all, I really knew very little about AMD other than the relationship we had in the joint effort on Flash. And the first thing that became apparent to me is, from a technical point of view, engineering-wise, they seem to have a very talented engineering team, and very creative, very innovative, highly respected in the industry. When you mention names of people that were at AMD, people outside had a lot of regard for them and all that. So to me, it's not that I was surprised. That was something I didn't know. So, and I was glad. I saw that we had a foundation from a technical point of view that was pretty strong. The one thing that I knew before I came to AMD because of my experience at Motorola, but I confirmed after I joined AMD that I was right, is that there was a lack of appreciation of the challenge of having to build your own factories, And as you may remember or know that, Jerry had that famous saying that real men own fabs.
Right.
And I knew how difficult that was and how it was getting difficult by the year. I mean, more and more difficult. So that immediately became, in my mind, something that I had to figure out. I had to figure out what we're going to do, how we're going to deal with the challenge of that is not understood well inside, and how do you do that? So that was one piece. And and probably the one that took me a year or so to come to a conclusion is, again, go back to the idea of that I really enjoy being in a position of transformational leadership, is that the company was doing a lot of things, and they could do less better than too many not so well. So we were doing memory business, we were in the communications business, networking business, computing business. You know, we it felt immediately to me that for the size of the company and the competition we had to deal with, that that was going to be a challenge. And again, so I had to step back and think, okay, so we got this factory issue and this broad product array. What should we do? And I slowly came to the conclusion that we had to get rid of all the products except computing. And that I had an answer for the factory people, but nobody liked my answer. And so I had to figure out, okay, how are we going to get all that going? And we developed a plan. I was very fortunate that I was able to bring in 2 or 3 people that were very critical to get the things done that we needed to get done. I divided it into a number of pieces, you know, but it was clear that we had to, as quickly as possible, divest ourselves of the non-computing stuff. So we sold the flash business, basically IPO'd it, you know, created a joint venture with Fujitsu, and then IPO'd that joint venture into the marketplace. We sold the communications business, sold the networking business, and then we ended up just keeping the microprocessor business.
So the flash business that you collaborated on from the Motorola side, you divested on
Right.
the.
Yeah.
Did Motorola eventually adopt the flash technology?
I don't think we were never able to make it successfully integrated with the MCU. It was the process differences were so big that we didn't succeed. That turned out to be a failure.
Oh, it's a
Yeah.
diversion. Okay, so you were divesting these. Yeah, how big? Well, first off, you left an $8 billion semiconductor business at Motorola. How big was AMD at the time when you came in?
I think it was probably around $4 billion, probably half
So
the size.
Half the size of what
Yeah.
you were.
But and this came out in the public, so I think this is known for those people that were familiar with AMD, but which is counterintuitive if you want to get rid of a business. But the business that was losing the most money was the microprocessor business. The business that was making any money was the memory business. And that's the one I wanted to get rid of. Because I didn't see, looking into the future, that we would be able to be in the commodity business and play with the Samsungs of the world and all that. And so, but we had to fix the computing side. And these events, so working with my team, we were able to develop a restructuring plan that cut cost out. We had to take some cost out that you normally do when you find that your cost structure is not out of whack, and so you did that. We started selling those pieces, and we were fortunate to be able to do it correctly. I mean, we did a pretty good job of that. Then we left the computing business, but we were lacking.
Computing was x86.
Yes, and we were lacking. To me, computational is not just the instruction set. You know, it's really beyond that. It's just this whole idea of the computational space. How do you want to play in it? And one of the conclusions we came to is that we needed the graphics computing machine, and I talk about it in the book. Eventually, you'll get to it if you read it. Is that NVIDIA and Jensen and I, we've been good friends for a long time, and we thought, wouldn't it be great if the two companies would combine? And we got NVIDIA GPUs and AMD x86 for a number of reasons, which I don't think would be appropriate for the world to know. We couldn't pull it off. But both Jensen and I wanted to do it, but we couldn't.
And what time frame, what years was that discussion started and broken off? Or
I'm going to say somewhere in 2002, 3, 4, somewhere in that time frame. But we needed to do that even though we couldn't pull that off. So we ended up acquiring ATI, which wasn't as ideal as I thought NVIDIA was, but it was not bad. It was actually a good thing. And I'm glad we did, because if you look at AMD today, over half of its sales are actually from the graphics side. So, and they got a good technology, good people, good products, and has been an excellent complement to the x86 side of the house. So we did that. The most difficult part was figuring out what to do about the factories. Just in the time that I had joined AMD to the time I was trying to figure this out, the cost of a factory went up by $2 billion. And just like that. I mean, and I knew that just looking at the future, I could see this thing just exponentially growing. Today, as you know, and we're sitting here in 2023, the factory is $20 billion now. And that's just not something that anybody can do. Intel may be able to do it, Samsung can do it, but not an AMD-sized company. So we put together a team of people to figure out, okay, what could we do? And we travel around the world trying to figure out the best solution. And what we came up with was the creation of Global Foundries, which was basically a sale of our factories to the United Arab Emirates, and with the idea that they would then manage this as a foundry. So they would be in a different business, not in the computing business, they'd be in a foundry business. They would get the technology from IBM and be a competitor to TSMC. That was the idea. And
when you say get technology from IBM, because AMD didn't have advanced technology required to compete in that business?
AMD's never did its own development. Always got the technology for microprocessors from IBM. Yeah. And it was good technology. It was pretty solid and helped AMD get to where it was at that time. But then the driver of the effort on the other side, I was driving this from the AMD side, but on the other side was the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. Really liked the idea of being in the high-tech business. And his dream was to build a factory in Abu Dhabi, and I frankly thought he could. When you really think about the way a woman dresses in that part of the world, it looks like a clean room garment. It's kind of like why the Japanese were able to be so careful in making things, because the culture was that way. Well, so I thought it would be simple to really create a work space that would adapt to being able to do this. And so that was his dream and his desire, and to do that, he was willing to buy the factories and then grow and create that. Needless to say, a complex issue like that took time. I remember for a period of 2 years, I don't think I was doing anything but trying to figure out a way to make that work. Because I'll give you one example that made it difficult is, I don't know if you remember, there's a time when Dubai wanted to buy American ports to manage them. And that was shot down by Chuck Schumer, who was a New York senator and still is. And I was afraid that he would shoot it down, because we were selling to, quote, the Arabs and all that. So I spent a lot of time with him trying to convince him that this was not like the port thing. This was really a good thing, and it wasn't going to be an independent company. And it took me a long time to just get him on board before we could even proceed on that. But slowly we were able to get all those things lined up and divested ourselves of the factories. And it's very easy math to do. If you say, what would happen if AMD had not done that? You can do the math today and it wouldn't work. Because there's no way that you could have what we have today, if we hadn't done that. So that was a major thing. But to do it, we had to get around an agreement that Jerry had done with Intel, that AMD would never use a foundry to make microprocessors. And frankly, how do you get around? I remember talking to the management at Intel at the time saying, what would it take for you to get out of this thing? And they say, no way, you're stuck. I said, you can't do it.
They'd be happy if you just went away.
Yeah. so I had to think of a clever way to do it. And so along with our team, we decided to sue Intel. We sued them for antitrust, violations. And we lined everything up, in my view, so perfectly that there was no way they could get out of it. They had to find a way to solve it. And that's what led to us being able to get rid of that constraint. So part of it.
Before you go into that, what fabs did AMD have at the time that were going to be spun out?
When we spun out the memory business, we had a fab in Austin that went with it. So that was one that went with it. We had a fab in Germany, and that was it, just one fab.
Oh.
And so when spun out, we went the German fab plus the fab that was about to be built in New York became part of that deal too.
I see. Okay. All right.
And
So go ahead.
And what was the structure? So the company that would run those, which was with the UAE, that was completely independent. It was partly a subsidiary. How was it structured?
It was created as being an independent company, and to be able to do the things we needed to do at AMD, we could not think of them as a subsidiary, and so it had to be an independent company. Now AMD retained a portion ownership because of the financial deal, but not the only. They're not the owner was Abu Dhabi, the sovereign wealth fund of the company.
So in the book, you go into a rather extensive description of this whole process of getting up to the point of suing Intel. This was not a simple business thing, and you had to convince a lot of people and the board and so forth.
It was hard.
And so the driving force was this issue around manufacturing microprocessors at a foundry. Was that sort of the core thing that tipped it over the edge? There were a lot of other issues having to do with Intel, right?
Yeah. I think that there were two things that we felt for AMD to thrive in the computing space had to be dealt with. One is get rid of the factories, But to do that, you have to be able to use a foundry. You can't unless you eliminate the contract that existed. It so happens that at the same time, Intel was doing things that we felt were illegal, that were violating antitrust law. And we did a lot of work figuring out where are those things and will the customers help us if we decide to sue them to prove that Intel was in the wrong. And so it was a lot of work. And so when we finally sued them was to hopefully have an effect on their marketing practices that we felt were illegal. But also the most important thing was to eliminate that constraint on foundry. And that ended up being that way. Now, it got settled. The suit with them got settled shortly after I left AMD. But he got all the things that we were trying to get, they were able to get. So they got rid of that constraint. Intel agreed not to do the bad things they were doing anymore. Whether that really worked or not, I don't know. And so I think it positioned AMD to do the things that they wanted to do as a result of being able to resolve it in an amicable fashion.
And so you came in 2000. There was a big downturn in 2001, right? The internet fiasco.
Mm-hmm.
And
the dot-com bubble.
The dot-com bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And what were the years in which, when did you initiate the suit? When did you drop the bomb, so to speak?
It's probably the actual details, the actual date is in my book, but I think it's around 2005.
Yeah.
And was that a surprise that everybody knew it was coming? You'd been doing all this work beforehand.
I think it had to be a surprise to everybody, including Intel.
Mm-hmm.
The reaction, we can tell by the reaction to when we filed the suit, is to me clear, a deer in the headlights. They never thought this would happen. They never thought we would do it. And I think that was helpful to us at the time because we were able to get a lot of traction on the suit around the world. Mm-hmm. Japan ruled against him, Korea ruled against him, Europeans ruled against him. The only place we couldn't get to rule against him was the United States because we always have this crazy idea that, there is no such thing as antitrust and that people should compete and do whatever they need to. And like Bill Gates told me one time, he said, well, Hector, it's just playing hardball. And I said, no, there's a difference. I said, hardball is perfectly okay. Spitball is not.
And just for the record here, tell us about this process of convincing your board and so forth to undertake this, because this was not an easy decision for AMD to pursue, a path for AMD.
Well, it was very costly to begin with, and the board was always concerned about the fact that our earnings opportunity would diminish because it was going to be costly, and it was. So that was the difficult part. As most boards of public companies, there was a big concern about getting into a sinking hole of, the more you dig, the deeper you go, and so there was a lot of skepticism about. Then nobody doubted that we were on the right, trying to do it. They just were worried about whether we could actually do it and survive, and. It was just a lot of, discussions, and one of the things I would like to give credit to that was helpful in doing it was we had a game theory guy that came to help us prepare and was a big contributor to helping the board understand why we needed to do it. And he was a professor at Berkeley. His last name is Weber, and Stephen Weber, and his work was magnificent, and I think we could not have been able to pull off what we did if he hadn't been for the help he gave us. But he's a CIA analyst type of guy, where we worked through every possible thing that would occur as a result of doing it. Mm-hmm. And as for 99 out of 100, it happened exactly as the game theory predicted. And so to me, that helped the board feel like we really had done our work, done our homework.
You mentioned in your book a number of people that were particularly important. Also Arnoldo Hacks.
Yes.
And Barat.
Rangarajan.
Bob Rivet, Stan Winvik, Tom McCoy, Henri Richard. I don't know, are there a few that you want to talk about sort of?
Well, the internal sale had to occur first before we went out. I mean, it really, we had to get our salespeople, for example, prepare for the fact that you were not going to be talking to customers who might get pissed off because you're suing a supplier that's critical to them. And so and this, fortunately, all those people that I mentioned there bought into the idea that we had to do it, and therefore they themselves, and I learned that from my mistake at Motorola, by the way, when I tried to do the transformation, that say you got to get these people's blood before you turn them loose. I mean, you got to make sure that you get a vial of blood out of them, and they all signed up, and I think that was really helpful, because anytime any customer would bring it up and challenge it, they would act very much well prepared. By the way, this was the preparation that was done to do this was enormous, and it was done around the world. We had people in every market that worked on it, and like I said, it was successful everywhere except the U.S. was the only place we couldn't get the antitrust organizations to take it seriously. But all that led to Intel feeling the pressure to say we got to find a way to settle this, because we'll never know. But if we had gone to court and they had lost, the penalties of antitrust violations are severe. It's possible that they could have been hit with such a large amount of money that it would have impacted them severely, much worse than anything we had ever done. So I think that was one motivation, as they began to see that around the world these things fell in place. And if I were in their shoes, I think I would have said, why are we taking the risk of potentially losing this in court when we can probably settle it, And frankly, at the time when they settled it, Intel was still the king of the hill on manufacturing. And they couldn't imagine anyone else being as good as they are. Now the world changed in the last several years. Now we got TSMC ahead of Intel in technology, who happens to be the foundry that makes AMD's products. So.
And the part of the book I got to was you were going around to Microsoft, Dell, various major customers, trying to convince them to come along in some ways.
Well, not so much convince to not fight us, to not be negative, If possible, be positive on what we're doing, but if not, don't say anything. Don't be, and that worked. That worked.
And that was an essential part of the preparation.
Yeah.
So you said things happen according to the game theory. How did, just in terms of time, money spent, and results, how did it go versus your expectations?
Well, it's easy for me to say because I left before it got settled, but I think they settled for such a little amount of money that I wonder if they could have settled for better. That's the only question I have. Everything else is exactly as we had planned, and the customer's reaction and the customer's willingness to support was better than I thought, better than expected.
And the time frame?
Time frame was probably, as it always happens, it's a little longer than you wanted it, but these things tend, because what we'd not anticipate that kind of screw things up a little bit on time was the 2008 recession, the Great Recession, as they call it. That really kind of slowed things down and made it also difficult to then get the board to be excited about selling the fabs because the value of things had dropped so dramatically that, in my opinion, the Arab Emirates got a hell of a deal, much better than they thought when they signed the deal, because the market collapsed in 2008. I think AMD stock was down to $2 or something like that.
So, talk a little about what was happening on the technical side and the microprocessor side. You said the acquisition of ATI was very helpful. Where does the acquisition of NextGen fit in here? Was that done before you or after you?
After. Yeah.
After.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how competitive was AMD during your time, and were you able to significantly change that? What were the challenges on just the technical product side?
These are really challenging products to design and make. So, but remember, one of the things I said that was so strong about AMD is a very talented technical people. They came up with the Opteron technology in the 2002, 2003 timeframe, more or less, give or take. And Opteron became the standard microprocessor in x86 because it was, as you may remember, 64-bit technology, but it was compatible with 16-bit. So that if you had designed a system around 16-bit, you didn't have to redo the whole thing to incorporate 64-bit technology, and you're ready for whenever the time came, the 64-bit took over. So that's the Opteron product gave us a huge boost. Not as good as it should have been based on the technology and how much of a leadership product it was, because we were still in the middle of these unfair practices that Intel was doing. And it was tough to penetrate some of the accounts where, Intel would threaten them if we did business with them. Right. So even though it was a phenomenal product, and it did well, we went from 0 market share to 20-30% of the server market at that time. It could have been better. It was really that good of a product. And then we hit the 2008 recession, and the next generation of Opteron, which was called Barcelona in the market at the time, ended up having a bug. And that really set back the effort that AMD had going. And under normal circumstances, I don't think that would have been as serious, but with a recession on, things slowed down and weak, and hadn't settled the legal parts too. It was really hard to not let that damage the company. So that made it a little more painful than we wanted to go. We knew it was going to be painful to resolve the legal suit and sell the fabs. It was going to be a big challenge, but then it got a little more difficult to do because of the Barcelona challenges that we had. And then, of course, the 2008 Great Recession also made it difficult.
So Barcelona was which years then?
Barcelona was after Opteron, so it had to be, I'm going to guess, in the 2006-07 timeframe, something like that.
And the Opteron had integrated memory also and low energy requirements?
That's correct. It was a much lower energy chip than others, and also it had a unique inner chip communication protocol that made it very fast. It had a clever marketing name, which I can't remember right now. I can't think of it, but and again, back to hardball, spitball thing. We were the first company with a 64-bit out. Microsoft had 64-bit software ready to go, but refused to release it because Intel didn't have a 64-bit.
Because the Itanium was delayed, right?
And so we, not being today would be different. Today, AMD is much stronger and could exercise some power with Microsoft. But back then, point blank, the Microsoft people just say, hey, we have to wait for Intel to come out, and that was painful.
So you could sell to the server market and to various people that didn't care about having some of the Microsoft stuff.
Which that was probably one of the biggest success stories, is to be able to get it into those places. Yeah.
Right, and it sounded like from
But-
your book, the servers are particularly conscious of efficiency and energy. But I mean, what percentage of the market did that cut out, the fact that Microsoft would not move faster?
Well, it's not that they cut out the percent of the market, is that they didn't allow us to take advantage of the 64-bit migration. We could have dragged customers with us into the 64-bit world if Microsoft had been out, because we were the only ones that had the hardware to do it. But because of that, everybody that bought Opteron was actually doing it mostly for 16-bit, because there was no 64-bit software. So again, it's one of those, I think it's an unfair thing, but the Intel Microsoft partnership has been incredibly good for them. They both have made a fortune out of it. I think I'm sure there was a concern that if they release software that would help only AMD, could have been very damaging to the partnership. It would affect Microsoft in the end. So it's complicated.
But did manufacturers not buy the Opteron chip because they didn't have as much demand as if 64-bit had been really out there and people wanted software, wanted to run that stuff, then you would have sold more Opterons, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's no way to estimate the opportunity cost.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the Jerry Sanders situation. How did that, was the handover graceful when he decided to leave, or how did he decide to leave, or whose decision was that? And sort of, we talked about you coming in. What was the exit like?
Well, I like this thing. It doesn't matter how graceful it was. The outside world is still going to make up a story about it that most of the time is not accurate.
That's what
But no, Jerry got to a point where he saw that the sensible thing was to turn more power to me. That made sense. That's what he would prefer. That's what the board wanted to do. But being, in his DNA, he didn't see, if that were to happen, then what role does he have? The diminished role. I think he made a decision to leave. Nobody asked him to leave. He wasn't pushed out, or he just decided that with me taking over more and more control of things as the company was growing, he would prefer to do something different. And I totally understand it. I think, I don't know if you've met Jerry?
I have never met him. I've met so many others in the industry, but
I've
never met Jerry.
He's somebody that even if you don't know what he does, if you meet him, you realize that he's somebody who really likes being in charge, And I think he probably genuinely felt like, it would be difficult for him then to be around an environment where he's not the decision maker, And
So there were two major decisions, I guess, after he left: the divestiture of the fabs and the suit of Intel. Was he involved in any way in those discussions, or?
He was, even after he left, he was always involved as a consultant advisor. We talked to him, but not as a decision maker. When we made a decision to do the fab thing, I remember him calling and saying, I knew you were going to do this, and the only thing I was trying to figure out is whether I should learn Chinese or Arab. So that's kind of the relationship that was had. But so I mean, I totally get.
What
where
about
he
the
was
Intel suit?
There was not, he sued Intel before I came on another. There was some violation of the agreement that he had with Intel, and he won that suit, but the judge gave him $1. So it was kind of like one of those things. Yeah. So he's very familiar, he probably even more so than I am, of how difficult it was to fairly deal with a competitor like Intel. But I think he was concerned that we didn't know since he did it, and he figured out how difficult it was. He probably was afraid we didn't understand what we were getting into. So he was, not that we were doing the thing wrong, it's just that it was such a difficult thing to do. What he wasn't aware of is how much time we spent preparing for it. I mean, he really was not involved in that, and I can tell you, I look back, I mean, that preparation alone deserves a book because it was brilliantly done by the people that were doing it. Just every aspect was covered. In the meetings that we had, this facilitator from Berkeley would ask me, for example, to play the role of the CEO of Intel. And I said, and since I know about AMD more than Intel does, they would tell me, here's what we're going to do at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. What's going to be your reaction? And I could do and say things that would have been very difficult for an Intel person to do and say. But once we did it, it was so obvious that that's what they were going to do, that we were prepared for that. And so it was, I mean, I can't say enough about the preparation that was done.
So you left AMD when?
I think I left around 2000, as soon as we did the deal, about 6 months after the deal. So
After the foundry deal?
The foundry deal. And went to help global foundries. And that's another thing that's not as commonly known is the Emirates people would probably not have done the deal if I hadn't volunteered to help them. And so to me, it was so critical in this transformational effort that we had that if we didn't do that 5 deal, I don't see how AMD could compete, And so when that came up, and I'll never forget this Arab person looking me in the eye and I said, if you think this is such a good deal, why don't you come help us? And so it was tough for me to do that because I didn't get a chance to see the whole thing go through from the AMD side, So I did leave and helped them out for about a year, and then left. And then the only sad thing I feel about them is they changed their strategy. They got spooked by competing with TSMC, and Global Foundries went away from the dream that the Crown Prince in Abu Dhabi had of being a really strong competitor to TSMC, to now they're more of a niche supplier of technology that's unique. I mean, it's very unique. I mean, they're doing gallium arsenide, for example. They're doing RF, silicon RF technology, so there are places where there's no question that they'll do well and compete, but they're not going to be anywhere near the size that they could have been. So they got spooked. It's a difficult market, as I'm sure you know. It's
how did they even get involved in this process? I mean, how did you sit down with the Crown Prince?
Well, that's really an interesting question, and fascinating to me. I mean, another book I could write about. They, AMD was a Ferrari sponsor. You know? We sponsored Ferrari, and we got lucky. We sponsored Ferrari during the days when Schumacher won every race, you know. So we had a big awareness by people that AMD was a very sexy technology company. Well, it just so happens that Abu Dhabi, the Arabs, were also a sponsor from an investment point of view of the Ferrari event. You know, so we both had a connection through Mr. Ferrari, you know. And one day,
The Mr. Ferrari.
the Mr. Ferrari, you know, can't think of his first name is either Esno or Enro.
Enzo.
Enzo. He's the Enzo's grandson, something like that. One day, our headquarters, if you want to call it that, for AMD was in Italy, for Europe. And our European general manager was a very close friend of Mr. Ferrari. Okay. So one day we were having dinner, and I was explaining to him the challenge that we're having trying to find some way to create this opportunity for these factories. Then he said, why don't I introduce you to the Crown Prince? I said, I've heard him talk about how he wants to divest from oil into high tech. And I said, well, that'd be great. So he made a call. The Crown Prince agreed to see me for 5 minutes. You know, so I flew to Abu Dhabi with a couple of people in my company. And so we're sitting in this gigantic palace in an office waiting for the Crown Prince. So the Crown Prince comes in, you know, says hello, shakes his hand, and he said, I'm really serious about divesting. Tell me a little bit about why you think this might be good for us. So I started explaining to him about the future and the factories and how semiconductors are going to be the oil of the future and blah, blah, blah. And as it turns out, you know, given what's going on today, it's all working out just like actually I told him back then. And he started listening, and the 5-minute meeting turned into a 2-hour meeting. And he really, you could see his excitement and all that stuff. And so when it came time to leave, we were going to walk out to the car. And so I'm walking out to the car. He comes and grabs me by the arm and walks me to the car, you know. And the guy said to me, the Crown Prince has never walked anybody to the car. So it kind of made me think, okay, he's really
Got his
interested.
attention.
He's really interested. So the next day he called up and said, look, I want to figure out a way to make this deal. It's not a question of if, it's how. And he said, so he asked me a favor. He said, I just want you to do something for me. And I said, what is it that you want? I want you to have a board meeting here so that the board sees what I'm talking about. So we did. I had a board meeting in Abu Dhabi. I flew everybody there. And he came into the board, gave a little talk and talked about what he wanted to do. And that was very helpful because so many of the board members were, I mean, about
Not real, it's over there or whatever, yeah.
I mean, they were scared. They were frightened. But so, I mean, how that came about. So there's no, I'd like to say, you know, I'm such a good salesman.
Well, I guess you were.
But you know, but it kind of points out to me how important it is to know people and respect them for, you know, I mean, I respected his desire to divest his economy. I didn't ridicule him like some people do, you know, because when you think about it, it's challenging. You see this nothing but sand, and this country that's a city sits there. Of course, they own a lot of oil, and you know that if they set their mind to it, they can do it if they wanted to. And I really think they would have if they had them. In my opinion, what spooked them is McKinsey as a consultant probably told him it would be very difficult and the failure, the likelihood of failure could be higher than he thought, perhaps. And one of the things I know that that culture is very afraid of is being ridiculed, being belittled, and so they somehow that they backed off from the original idea.
But I wonder if you saw some of the same. It's another form of transformation, obviously. The kind of challenge
right.
that interested you.
Yeah.
But before moving on, I have a couple of questions. Some from David Laws. I don't know if you know, but colleague of Doug's with semiconductors here. But how did the culture at AMD differ from that of TI and Motorola? So maybe start with that.
Well, they are three very different companies. In my time at TI, it was a period of time when TI was just at the top of the world. I mean, they were anti-bureaucracy. They eliminated. I found it so interesting when I joined first. Everybody wore short sleeves, no tie, jeans. Even the CEO dressed like that. There was camaraderie. You felt very close to each other, and it was a company that could not see that if it was important, that's something they should not be in. If it was in, and an example I'll give you is they invented bubble memories, but they didn't commercialize it. They invented liquid crystal displays, and they didn't commercialize it. They, invented the calculator and the watch, but they couldn't capitalize on it like the Japanese were able to. On one hand, there was amazing. So I learned a lot about how to get bright people to do their thing and create technology. But I also learned a lot about how difficult it is to channel all that into a successful enterprise. And an example of that, TI invented this thing called the OST. I don't know if you're familiar with the Objective, Strategies, and Tactics. And he became famous, became a Harvard business study. And I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. But it had a flaw in it, and that is people became so focused on the process of creating the objectives, trying the tactics, that they completely forgot the vision of what the company was trying to do. So he got mired in bureaucracy and all that. But it was, to me, a great place. Motorola, on the other hand, was a family company. The Galvin family owned it. I mean, it was public, but they owned pretty much all the decisions. And they were very family-oriented in the sense that they put in place a thing they used to call a participative management program, PMP they call it. And what it did is that every manager needs to figure out a way to let the employees participate in the decisions made. And it was pretty brutal. It's in the sense that if you didn't agree with that, the CEO, Mr. Galvin, would ask you to leave the company. I mean, that's how hard they pushed it. And he had good things, because he made people at the very low levels feel like they were participating in company. But like everything else, if you're not careful, it can go beyond where you meant to. And then you had people that really were not capable of making decisions, doing things that were not proper. And so that's the culture. AMD to me was people were having fun at AMD. They were a scrappy little company, very smart people. They wouldn't take no for an answer on anything. What I saw was just an opportunity to transform it into something bigger, but not change necessarily some of those things that helped them get to where they were. And to me, there were there was a can-do attitude that was contagious and very positive that I think is still there. So it's very different. I mean, and the one of the things that I find very in a way depressing because that when one learns all these things in life, all of a sudden you find out that you're too old to benefit from all the learning you've done. Because not many people have that opportunity that I had to learn all that. But then you get to this point in life where you say, what do I do with all that learning? Well, all I can think of, hopefully, is somebody might watch your video and learn something from it. But I can no longer go run a company, And it's. I even thought about figuring. As a matter of fact, I'm still doing a little bit of work with a consultant, trying to figure out, is there a way we could tap into the people that are in their 60s and 70s that could contribute, but not like a CEO or full-time employee, but
That's another discussion, but there are, in San Francisco, there's a group where people advise companies that are retired people from the same industry. But that's
I'm just trying to think of it at the next one level up from that, in the sense that, because I've done a little bit of a polling of people that I know, people would love to spend 20 hours a week. See, you don't have to buy them health insurance because they're on Medicare. But they would love to spend 20 hours a week doing something that's really fun and exciting, not to just advise somebody on something. And just imagine all the talent that's around that and what you could do with it. I haven't figured out how to do it, but I'm working with a lady that's been a business consultant, used to work for Steve Jobs when he was running the company. She's very smart. I'm trying to figure out, is there a way we could do that so that people have a chance to transfer some of that knowledge by working on a particular exciting project? The one thing nobody wants to do, people that are good, they don't want to get involved in anything that requires routine stuff. They don't want to involve in figuring out how to cut 10% of the cost. But if you're going to work on the next generation of secure computing, they'll love to spend 20 hours here, even if they don't get paid. So there's an opportunity that nobody in the world has figured out how to tap into.
Oh, very interesting. I have some thoughts I'll say after the. And in terms of culture, and this could come into that too, but we're also researching the history of diversity programs. Did any of these three companies have formal efforts to increase diversity, or certainly some were federally mandated, right?
I'm not aware of Texas Instruments having had anything like that. That could have been, the 70s might not have been the appropriate time for that time ago. Motorola definitely did, and AMD had also. Personally, I'm not so sure how effective they are. A good bad example of that is the NFL. They have diversity programs, and they still only have 1 or 2 black coaches. So I'm not sure that people have found how to make that work. However, I mentioned earlier in the conversation that the biggest exposure to bigotry got to me when I was CEO of AMD. After 2 years I was in the job maybe a couple of years as CEO, and somebody at one of the main magazines wanted to do an interview with me and my staff. And I said, fine. The first question he asked everyone on my staff was, how does it feel to work for a Mexican? Now, to me, that's indicative of, and this is the press. This is the press who supposedly is, woke, if you use that expression. It shocked my people, it shocked my staff, because they didn't know what to say, It was the last question they expected, and and it kind of bothered them a little bit because no matter what you say, it's never going to come out right. And then on top of that, you add the editing that's done by the media. But so that's an example of that, and that happened twice with two of the probably the most famous magazines in business. Then the other part is, I was coming back from the trip to Brazil, and there were 5 of us, 6 of us in the plane, and it was a private plane. And when you come back from out of the country on a private plane, you have to land on the nearest port of entry first and go through customs. So the pilot chose to land in Laredo, to go through customs. And I fell asleep. So I was asleep in the back, and I didn't even know when the plane landed. So I mean, I'm a sound sleeper when I comes in. So the plane landed, I'm asleep in the back. The customs officer comes in and checks the passports and all that, and looks at my staff, and then he sees me asleep back there. So he looks at one of my staff and says, "Why do you choose to bring the mechanic with you on the plane?" And I thought to myself, gee. So, see, I didn't go through that when I was in school or in college or when I was a middle-level executive, but the bigotry and the bias is that there comes a level above which you're not supposed to see these people. So you question it, and I could give you dozens of things like that happened to me when I was CEO of AMD that never happened to me at a lower level.
Because people didn't expect you to be at that level. At other levels, it's sort of
That's all I can
but
think
at that
of.
level, it didn't fit.
Yeah, that's all I can think of.
Glass ceiling, kind of.
Yeah.
But you don't think the diversity, you don't think the diversity programs help to remedy some of that particularly?
It's not that I don't think, it's that I haven't been able to see something that you can attribute directly to the diversity effort. I mean, I became CEO of AMD not because of the diversity program. It's a public company. I mean, nobody's going to put you in charge and tell the shareholders, by the way, we're filling the diversity slot. That's just not going to work. So I've questioned it only because I think there's something missing yet. I think the educating people about the differences and cultural biases is important because sometimes you're not aware of it, and you can, but to have a diversity program that implies in its implementation that it's going to address the lack of representation at certain levels, I haven't seen that yet. As being even Motorola, that was to me one of the best companies to sensitive to people. That's paid off.
And then, okay, with NVIDIA, right, it went to ATI. But at ATI, you had to write down, there was a loss involved,
There was what?
With ATI, there was a loss?
There was some question about the write-down of ATI. Was there,
I wonder if that was
I don't think it's important.
after my...
Um,
I mean, the one thing that about ATI is that the people outside AMD, particularly in the financial markets, questioned the wisdom of buying ATI. They didn't think it was right, and they questioned the price we paid for it. They thought it was too high. There was a lot of criticism of me personally for having made that decision. I don't, to me, that was their right to criticize me. The result is that without ATI, AMD would not be where it is today. You know.
So, getting back to the transition with Jerry Sanders, how was the transition with you? When did you decide that you were going to make the transition to help Global Foundries? And do you take a position there as president of that operation, or what?
I was interim chair of the board.
Okay. And were you completely out of responsibilities at AMD when you took that on?
Yes.
So how did the transition out of AMD go? What were the driving forces? Was there somebody groomed to take your place? What was the?
The person that took my place was the design manager. It was a fellow named Dirk Meyer. And the idea was that because I was going to be around and the board was not changed, was the same, that there was time to help Dirk grow into that position. You know, some other board members felt like he was a very smart guy that needed some time and grooming to be able to get into the slot. But then I wasn't involved anymore. And so at some point in time, something must have occurred that made the board feel like he really wasn't the guy they wanted. And so he left. And so I think he was there perhaps a year or so, some of that. And of course, I didn't know all the other people that came after that.
Right. So you went off so how did what was your contribution at with Global Foundries? What was the, where did you think your most valuable contribution was, and how did you decide to end that? What was that meant to be like a year-long process and have someone else take over, or what was the?
It was supposed to be about a year. Nothing hard specific about a date, but it was supposed to be about a year. And my job was supposed to help them figure out how to set in motion the strategy that would make them a competitor to TSMC. Mm-hmm. Okay. But somewhere in that time frame, 9 months into it or something like that, it became clear that they didn't want to do that. Mm-hmm. You know, they wanted to change that to go the direction of selectively being
supplier,
competitive. Yeah. And I didn't feel I really could contribute to that. Mm-hmm. So I decided to call the option that they had given me, that I could leave whenever I felt mm-hmm. that, something either had changed or that I couldn't do anymore. Mm-hmm. And so personally, I think they missed a huge opportunity if they had stuck with it. Because I think given the scenario today where the world, that our nation is concerned about security, and there's a lack of leading edge products in this country, it would have been a perfect fit.
Yeah, having Global Foundries as a major supplier now would change the landscape.
So I think they missed a big one.
Yeah. So what happened? This was 2000. When did you leave Global Foundries?
Probably around 2009 or 10, something like that.
So what was life like after that? What was?
Well, it's probably everybody goes through this. I probably overreacted to the fact that I didn't have a real job anymore. Mm-hmm. And I got involved in way too many things. I got involved in too many boards. I got involved in too many nonprofits, political events. And pretty soon, after 2 years, my wife said to me, "You're working harder than when you were running the company." And she was right. I think
I've heard this before.
I think it was the desire to fill my time that I frankly overdid it. And so I started slowly divesting. and what I ended up, I soft landed, if I can use that word, into a place that I'm really enjoying. I'm helping some startups, And I have a criteria that's because people ask me, oh, what's the criteria for you? It's very simple. First of all, it has to be led by at least one of the people that's a founder. It has to be a person that's underrepresented, either a person of color or a woman. The second thing, it has to be something that's crazy, that's really not. I mean, if it works, it's great, but if it doesn't work, people will say, well, we knew it wasn't going to work. It's got to be not another app for, reserving hotel rooms or something. So it's something very different. And third, the chemistry between me and the people have to be solid, good, because we're going to sleep, eat together, and try to make this work. So I have three small companies that fit that category that I'm involved helping them. And I'm really enjoying it. These are people very young, probably between the ages of 25 to 35, somewhere in there. And they just don't, no way they're going to accept that nothing can be done. So it's a lot of fun, and I help them trying to find some seed money. I help them sometimes with advice, because there are some things that obviously can only come from experience, and and so that's one thing. The other piece that's a third of my time. The other third of my time is, I think we have a serious problem in Texas, where I live, with the Latino population not going to school. So I'm involved with some groups of people that are trying to put in place efforts to keep people in school and help them, attend college if they can. The most successful of them is an organization called Breakthrough, which really it's done an amazing job of grabbing kids in the 4th grade. That's the entry point. They grab them in the 4th grade and stay with them until they graduate from college. And they're really amazing people. It's really committed, and I'm pretty happy with that. And the third and the most difficult one that I'm doing, it so far has been a grandiose failure, is trying to get people to vote. In Texas, we're number 50 in voter participation. And Texas being the second largest state with 38 electoral votes, that's dangerous when you have that low level of participation. So it's been disappointing to me how difficult it is to get people to vote. And I realize that a lot of people are trying to make it harder to vote, but I don't think that's the reason. I think it's just we haven't found the fire that can motivate these
people aren't motivated
to come out and vote. And there was a glimmer of hope in the last election. The number of young people in that age group, 25 to 35, 18 to 35, went up by 50% in Texas. And so it gives me some hope that maybe we have to stop worrying about the fact that the older people don't vote and focus only on the young people. And so we're going through some transitions trying to see if, and maybe that's true. The 60-year-old Latino that's never voted may never vote. And we have to just accept that and work with a 16-year-old that's going to become 18 in 2 years, and hopefully they'll vote. And so those are the three things.
You're talking in terms of this younger group, talking mainly about Latino youth or youth in general?
Youth in general, on the voting side. And so I found my level now that I can live with. But in the beginning, it was really difficult. I mean, I was way overdid it. And I don't know if everybody goes to that or just, but
yeah, I've heard the common thing of working harder after retirement than before.
But I've enjoyed it. I'm really having fun doing it. I mean, I'll give an example of one of the groups. It's a group of 6 people. 3 are from Mexico and 3 are from the U.S. And the 3 from Mexico are from a school called the Tecnológico de Monterrey, which is the MIT of Mexico. It's a really well-known school. and the 3 from here are from Stanford. And they came up with an idea that combines visible light with radio frequency to detect cancer, skin cancer. You don't have to do a biopsy. And so far, the data suggests that it's more accurate than actually the biopsy. And so they're trying to figure out a way they can get enough trials done to get the attention of somebody that can put money in it, so they can scale up. And so to me, that's interesting. That's
Yeah, absolutely.
breakthrough, and it's particularly important for things that are invasive, because it's not invasive.
Is it shining light on the skin? Is that?
Yeah, and it has a RF beam that disturbs the skin, and the way the light deflects is detected, and it's based on AI, by the way. It's got an AI algorithm that the more you do it, the better it gets in accuracy. And the most promising result right now is in India. They're running a test of several thousand, hundreds of thousands of women on cervical cancer, because cervical cancer is very invasive. I mean, the procedure for doing a pap smear, they call it, it's very invasive. Women don't like it, and very uncomfortable, and it takes a long time, and it's expensive. And this is very fast. In 5 minutes, you know the answer, and it costs a fraction of what it costs to do it.
So it works for skin cancer, but also internal if it's
Right.
visible in some
Y-
way
it-
to a probe.
There's a good chance it'll work in. They're even trying to figure out if they could put it in a pill that you can swallow, and it'll detect things in your colon and your digestive tract. But so it's kind of, really, and the person that wrote the algorithm is actually a woman from Mexico. So it's very fascinating to me to see these young people. Now, doesn't mean it'll be successful, but it's great experience for these people to be going through.
So, do you have any thoughts on your successors at AMD and what they've done right or wrong, and how they've been able to do significant growth?
Yeah, well, there were a number of CEOs that followed me that I wasn't there to observe, to see what is it that transpired. But there were 3 or 4 people that they went through pretty fast, unfortunately. So there must have been something that the board was not happy with. I don't know what it is and all that, but that I'm sure made it difficult for the company to figure out what to do when every year or 2 you change CEOs. But the last CEO that's there, Lisa Su, who I've known for a long time, couldn't be a more perfect fit for the company at the time that she came in. She's incredibly smart, MIT PhD in science, engineering. Just brilliant. I mean, this lady is in a class by herself in terms of being smart, and genuinely trying to do what she thinks will make the company continue to be successful and grow. And she was very, very, very quick to take advantage of the things that we did, that we tried to do to position the company. The fact that by getting rid of the contractual obligation with Intel to have to go to foundries, to not have to go to foundries, she jumped on that really quick, and as a result, AMD products are at the leading edge of technology, thanks to the fact that the foundries are at the leading edge of technology. So she did that pretty well. The other thing that she picked on that to me was incredibly important for the success that AMD has had is to really focus to win in the server space, or high-end computing, or high-power computing, or advanced computing. All those things fall in the same kind of sphere. She put a lot of effort in that because the AMD products are actually the best in that space. and so she's benefit from that. The third piece is the integration with the business of graphics. She's done a fantastic job being able to get ATI and computing to jointly be able to address the needs of their customers. And I think the world of her, and I think that the future of AMD is pretty bright if she continues to be there. But she's kind of like a franchise football player, you know. Surprised Intel hasn't poached her. But really, I just think that unfortunate that 3 or 4 other CEOs went through before they found her, because that delayed AMD's success. But where they are right now, it's phenomenal, and I think a lot of it is the result of her work. So I think she's very perfect fit.
So how has your thinking about your field changed over the decades? What will it look like a decade from now?
The what changed?
How will your field look a decade from now? Predict the future.
In semiconductors in general?
Yeah, I think that. I mean, it's meant to be open-ended, but it
Okay.
seems the most appropriate.
Well, you know, at the time that I wrote my book, at the end, I put an epilogue, and at the time I wrote it, I believed what I wrote, but I didn't realize how accurate actually it was going to be. And there are, not in the order of priority or anything, but the 2 major things that are happening, one of them is so transformational that it's going to be the equivalent of the internet, in my opinion, is artificial intelligence. I think that from things that are sort of mundane, like this thing going around right now that's so popular, this chat
GPT.
GPT, yeah, which are kind of fun and people are having fun, to something that's much more serious, like in healthcare, for example, and other places. I think artificial intelligence is just gonna, and this has opened the door, by the way, for companies like AMD and NVIDIA, both of them, where the products they're doing are going to fit perfectly into the future of AI. You know? And I even think that my expectations what AI was going to be able to do and contribute were not even wild enough. I think that this thing appears to be developing a lot faster than I thought, and it's going to find its home everywhere, kind of like the internet has. So I think that's definitely it. But the other part, then you have to say, well, what's going to enable that? You know, you don't get artificial intelligence out of the air. How do you enable it? And the technology that's going to enable that, it's going to be sort of a hybrid approach to how do you put things together? How do you create the computing, you know, the scalar and vector graphics needed, scalar computing and vector computing needed to accomplish all these things? How do you put them together in a way that allows this to occur easily and cost effectively? It's going to be a hybrid approach to building these things so that you can mix technologies. So you can put communications, for example, in the same space. You can put RF technology in the same space. You can put even perhaps mix substrates such as gallium arsenide and others in the same space. When with the advent of this technologies like graphene, for example, and other things that are going to enable all these things to happen, it's entirely possible to me that we are not going to interact with machines at all, other than by the machines detecting how we feel, how we sound, what we say, what our eyes do. There's no keyboards. There's no. I think we're entering a very exciting place. And you're beginning to see the beginnings of it. The you know the fact that who would have thought a few years ago that you could actually tell your car, take me to this place, and the car knows how to take you. And if you happen to be on one of those that have self-driving, you don't even have to do anything. You just have to tell it. It's just normally, but the two are connected. You know, you got the AI and you got the enabling technologies right behind it. And of course, the glue that gets everything together is the algorithms and software. You know, that to me is going to change even the existing software companies dramatically. Take the example of Google. You know, I don't know how you feel about Google search, but to me, it's kind of poor. Every time I do a Google search, I get 10,000 things. Why do I want to look at them? Why can't I just get the answer I want? You know, and this is where AI, properly done, frankly, could be the next Google. You know, now of course I'm sure Google is aware of it, and they're trying to figure out a way not to lose that opportunity.
Well, they don't want to get you to the right answer too quickly. They want to show some ads on the way.
Exactly. So I just think we're in for a pretty exciting ride in AI and all these things that make it work, that enable it. You know?
And the graphics coprocessor being adapted to AI seems like
exactly
the path for that.
And by the way, there's no doubt in my mind, although I don't know this for a fact, I'm guessing that NVIDIA and AMD are heavily involved in thinking about this and probably ahead of anybody in terms of the enabling technology.
And making it low powered enough to put in at the edge and not just through a huge data center, right?
Right.
So then getting ready for the one word, in general, not the one word, but what suggestions can you offer to young people, especially young Latinx people interested in technology? And I know that you said the proceeds from your book were going to a scholarship fund at University of Texas.
Right.
But if you could talk about both of those.
Well, let's start with that one first, because that one's been done. We established a fellowship at the University of Texas for capable people. Like, you know, first of all, you have to qualify to get in, you know, but assuming that you get in and you're Latin or underrepresented either way, that scholarship is established. It's at perpetuity. It'll last until, you know, someday it runs out of money or whatever. But it's been fed continuously, and that exists right now, and so that part is done. The thing, this is a real difficult thing to why do you tell, you know, Latinx people about, you know, what advice would you give? I always struggle with it. I mean, I gave a talk one time to a group of students. There were about 200-300 students in the audience, and there were two of us speaking, and all of them were 100% of them were Latino students. Okay? This speaker that went before me talked to them about working hard and you know, all these things that you normally think of. And it was really hard for me to follow up and not say something, because I knew more about the students than he did. He was just a speaker that didn't really know who he was talking to. And so I said, you know, you're already working hard. I know some of you have 2 or 3 jobs in addition to going to school, and that your parents are working hard to help you. And I said, so you've done all that. You've passed that test, you know. The only thing I encourage you to do now is to be curious. Be curious in everything you do. Don't ever stop being curious. And when the curiosity opens up a door that says, you know, maybe this might look like a great thing, then don't be afraid to walk through the door. Now, it may not work. You may get to the other side and go, ah, jeez, and start all over. But be curious, he said, and you'll be amazed at the things that you personally are going to observe and open up. And then you'll decide which ones you want to take on. But don't be afraid to do it just because of fear. If you choose not to do it because it's just something you didn't want to do. But do it. But whatever it is, be curious. And that's the only thing I could think of that made sense to me, because when I look back at, since I was a young kid, I was curious about everything. You know, not just science. I mean, I was curious about every single thing. I was curious about what, you know, every small town has a square. They call it plaza in Spanish. And women walk counterclockwise and men walk clockwise. And said, I was a little kid and I was curious, why do they do that? Then my mother had to explain to me and said, well, they're flirting with each other. And you can't flirt if you're behind somebody. And I thought, wow, that makes sense. So you have to be curious and ask questions. I learned from Bob Galvin, who was one of my mentors that I respect the most at Motorola. He was the son of the founder of the company, Motorola. And one of the things he always say, that you have to ask the question why until you get tired of the answers that are given to you. He said, don't stop at one why. When you ask somebody, why is this happening, and they give you an answer, they're probably not giving you the answer you want, so you get to say, why again? Why? And it's so true, you know, it's absolutely true. And the other thing that I learned from Bob Galvin, too, was one day when I got promoted to be in charge of the semiconductor sector at Motorola, that was a big job. It's an $8 billion business, 30,000 people around the world. And I had one person that I inherited whose division was the most profitable, the fastest growing, but he was not a good person. And I struggled because if you look at the metrics, I should be promoting him because he makes the most profit, he's the company, his division grows the fastest. I said, but here are the things I don't like. And you know, I can tell you briefly, is he came to work drunk. He had affairs with probably every woman around him, and he treated people like dirt. Okay, but because he was very profitable in growing, he was able to give big bonuses to his people, and so they put up with it. So I didn't know what to do. So I went to Bob Galvin. I said, Bob, I have this problem. You know, I need your help. So you've been around a long time. What can you help me with? And he looked at me, and typical Bob, you know, he leans back, puts his feet on the desk, and says, are you married? And I said, yeah. He said, you have children? I said, yeah. He said, would you like your children to grow up to be like him? And I said, no. I said, then you have the answer. And I thought to myself, wow, that was simple. That didn't take long, and that was simple. I think we complicate things too much. That's why I think curiosity is great at uncomplicating things, you know, and to ask. You don't have to know everything. You just have to ask, and ask, and ask, and ask. And
so then, drawing on your wealth of life experiences, what one word of advice would you give to a young innovator or entrepreneur? And can you tell a story that illustrates why you chose this word, which maybe you already have? But
well, like that beer commercial said, you know, stay curious, my friend. Instead of stay thirsty, stay curious, my friend. You know,
so the one word would be
curiosity. And you know, and sometimes you're going to be embarrassed by being curious. I mean, let's tell you, it's not, curiosity doesn't always lead to something that great, and or succeed. It embarrasses it. When I first got put in charge of figuring out why a particular product wasn't yielding, I found out that the product seemed to always have a scratch. And I thought, well, that's obvious to me that scratch is causing the problem, because every single product that didn't work had a scratch. So I went to my boss and said, I found the answer. The products are all scratched, and that's causing them to fail. I said, no. He said, when they fail, we scratch them, so nobody uses them. And I thought, oh, crap. So you have to chalk that up to experience and say, okay, next time I'm going to be more careful how I ask. But don't stop asking, though.
That's great. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to hopefully influence somebody.
That's great. We really appreciate it, and many words and comments of wisdom, and a great addition to our oral history program. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad to do it. I'm glad we were able to do it.